Hello, one and all, and welcome to this stream with my co-host Dominus, where we're going to go through the Wars of the Roses, the English 15th century more largely, and just have us look back at it from a narrative point of view mainly, and try to pick apart what story it still has to tell for us sitting here today in 2022. How are you doing, Dominus?
I'm doing very well, and I'm happy to be here. This was actually sort of if we can get it done. I think we wanted to do a series of streams leading from the beginning of the Wars of the Roses through the history of England all the way up to the the end of the War of the Spanish Succession and that period of English history. So this is like the first part of it, and I think this is obviously one of the most storied parts of England's history, and I think it's also one of my, I think it is my favorite piece. It's said to inspire shows like Game of Thrones and everything like that, and you can see why when you read of it. So yeah, we hope to extract certain insights from this discussion on what it can still tell us about England. And right, let's dive into it, I suppose.
Yeah, so it's just funny you say that. Like you used as your main text that Dan Jones book. I think it's called The Hollow Crown, is it?
The Hollow Crown, yeah.
And I remember that coming out, I'm going to say around 2014, 15 maybe. And yeah, Game of Thrones was like at its height in terms of popularity. It hadn't, quote, gone off the rails yet. Though maybe it kind of had, I don't know. But it was still very, very popular around then. I know if you were kind of young enough as I was then, it was very impressionable to read this history and exciting. It was difficult. I hadn't picked up a book surrounding it for a few years, and I picked up the 15th century book from the Oxford History of England by E.F. Jacob to kind of refamiliarize myself with this period. And even that part, though it's a much drier read than Jones, it can't help but be like thick and fast, especially when you get to like the two crunch periods, really, the beginning of the 1460s and then again the beginning of the 1470s. I find it's just I think particularly the life Edward IV leads is just ridiculous. But we'll get into that. And I wanted to, like Dan Jones' book, when I first read it, I remember you were trying to do the parallels between Game of Thrones and Wars of the Roses. And yeah, you're reading little bits online. And I finally decided to tackle that as a book, as a coherent structure that dealt with that period. And he starts off way earlier, and there's so much untangling of the 100 Years' War that still has to be done before you understand it. And so, yeah, and then you can go back even further, right, as well. As I said, the E.F. Jacob book starts in 1399. So 1399 to 1485 is a bookend, or was considered a bookend by Oxford authors in the mid-20th century, telling a narrative of England for this time. And so I also added a bit like this chaos in England. And if you pick up in Edward's career, and I say career, like it was their whole lives. If you pick up these latter parts, Edward, Richard III, Margaret of Anjou, okay, she's French ostensibly, but their lives are subsumed in this narrative that, looking back to the story, and you can kind of untangle a bit earlier, it's very interesting to see, though, that they would have been born up in this rupture, this chaos. And that's why I think it's interesting to see it as like, how could you be born into such a chaotic period? So in that sense, we'll go back a little bit and try and understand what we think narratively about some of the stuff that set in motion the Wars of the Roses.
Yeah, and I guess that bookend 1399 to 1485 was sort of a period in which, the English nobility, fresh from, well, they'd actually lost the 100 Years' War in the end, but England had become sort of solidified as a nation, and then the nobility basically collapsed. Like the House of Plantagenet destroyed itself and used its last energies in that period, and completely, by the end of it, there were barely any of them left. And so, the rise of the Tudors really marked like the end of medieval England, not only in terms of the period, like time period, but in terms of, I think, spirit as well, because shortly thereafter you had the Reformation and everything completely changed. And you think if the Plantagenets hadn't spent themselves in such a way, would the Reformation have taken place? Well, in England, that is, I'm not sure, but anyway.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And on rereading, that's the sense I get as well. Obviously, Shakespeare did a great job in conveying this history to a Tudor audience, even if you can say this was ahistorical, that was ahistorical. Narratively, in the 1590s, early 1600s, he did give a narrative to that Tudor audience that probably needed one going back a little bit further than the Tudors. But when I read it now, as you say, it's hard. It's a very clear break in English history. It's like a step function. There's no gradual ascent. It's like here they are out of the medieval period almost. The second the Bosworth, has gone quiet. And in that sense, it's this inferno, destruction of the old power structures of England.
Yeah.
That's
all right. Well, until Maximus returns, I suppose. So at the beginning. Oh,
all right. I'm back. Sorry, I don't know when I got muted there.
No, it's okay.
So carry on. You were going to start at the beginning. It's time we move.
You were talking. Did you want to finish up about the power structures of England, or?
Oh, just there's the clear demarcation point in 1485. That's when Bosworth goes quiet, and it's the end of medieval England in one moment almost. There's nothing gradual about it. That's certainly the sense I got on rereading it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, upon the accession of these Welsh interlopers, right? So Dan Jones's book, his introduction, actually, I like the way it starts because it sort of calls to mind what you were just saying. Margaret Pole. It starts off in 1541, so this is long into the reign of Henry VIII, and it starts with Margaret Pole, the daughter of George, the Duke of Clarence, and her mother, Isabel Neville, and it talks about her ancestry and how she's now like locked up in the Tower of London because she's one of the few people remaining that could threaten the new Tudor dynasty, and eventually she's executed. But it sort of describes like this is a woman from a previous era, like in May, on the 27th of May, 1541. That in that moment, as she looked out over the over the precincts of the Tower of London, it was almost like a woman it was clearly a woman from a different time in a different century, a century completely unknown and completely unknowable to those who lived late in the reign of Henry VIII. She's almost like a relic, and I guess that sort of emphasizes the break from the previous period. So that's all. And then we go back all the way to, well, I guess we can go back now to, let's say, 1399. Would you like to start there?
Yeah, I can give a brief intro into 39. So 1399 is the year in which Richard II is deposed by Henry Bolingbroke, son of John of Gaunt. John of Gaunt dies, I think, just in the early parts of this year, I believe. And then, well, he's the richest man in England. He's like the richest man from the 100 Years' War, from the lands he's attained, has gotten this extraordinary wealth. And so he, though he's older, his issue is kind of an underwriting threat to Richard II. And Richard II has this sort of dainty, effeminate court, right? That's I mean, not quite Edward II levels, but, you know, he'd been a boy king. And it's funny, there are these mirrors throughout, right? Richard II had been a boy king and he doesn't grow up to be a strong king. And you see that mirrored later by Henry VI. But Henry Bolingbroke, then Earl of Derby, is about to become Henry Lancaster and inherit from John of Gaunt. He gets his inheritance taken away from him by Richard II, who kind of wants he wants to fill the coffers that John of Gaunt has. And Henry is in exile at this time, and it's quite clear it's just a mark like you're never coming back, and I'm taking your land. So then I think I don't want to get too much into the detail on it, and it's a bit. I was reading back through Jacob's book, and the details are sketchy, as with all these invasions and you know, these hushed coups sort of thing. A few lords would have been with him in France in exile. A few would have been sympathetic to his cause in England. And very soon after he lands, like he gains enough support that eventually Richard, you know, ceases from the throne himself in Parliament. And it's not a bloody battle that you see in the 15th century. So it begins with that, and then what comes later is, well, was Bolingbroke did he even want the throne, or did he just want a sturdier run England? Was he actually the next in line? How many of the lords genuinely supported him to become king? I think he officially gets. You know, Jacob describes this character Bolingbroke as, you know, someone with a love for magnificence, a desire for military glory abroad, ardor, high spirit, and an independence of character. And that's probably just enough. There's nothing, and that's where a weak king allows these characters. I mean, that you could say that's a Carlylean take to fill the void. And there's different accounts of how cautious he was going for the throne, or whether he wanted it, whether he wanted something more constitutional. And I think actually it's constitutional in appearance. So he becomes Henry IV, by the way, and so it's constitutional in appearance, but in reality, he's unhampered by the constraints of the court, because he's sort of seized it himself by strength of character. So of course you can seize what's constitutional in appearance similarly.
Yes.
And there's a bunch of rebellions he has to put down. Shrewsbury is the most notable, where, you know, I think there's the Percys are the Earls of Northumberland, are the Northumberland family, and they have enormous wealth up there, bordering Scotland. And there's this big back and forth where he shuffles them back and forth between Wales and Scotland, trying to deal with these rebellions. Eventually,
the Percys are the quintessential family, you know, protecting the north. They're like the England's northern bulwark against Scottish invasion, and remain so through the reign of Henry VIII. Anyway, sorry, you were saying.
Yeah, but so Owen Glendower is big in Wales this moment as a rebellion in the 1400s, pretty much since Henry's accession right through to about 1408. Owen Glendower is a constant thorn in the side. And so there's a battle of Shrewsbury where there's a Mortimer that was taken in prisoner by Glendower, and the Percys get angry about how long it's taken to ransom him, and the idea is Henry doesn't actually want to ransom him because Mortimer may have a claim to the throne, which does come back.
This is a descendant of the mistress of the Queen, the mother of Edward III.
Possibly, I didn't.
Sorry, not the mistress. I mean the lover. That is, like Roger Mortimer.
Yeah, back to the 1320s, the Edward II time. Yeah, it could be, but basically, yeah, Henry IV's reign is a bit. He's dealing with all these rebellions. It doesn't have the narrative of what Henry V will be like when he's going to come in later. So it's a bit murky, and that's why even when Shakespeare is writing Henry IV Part 1 and 2, he puts his main character as Prince Hal, right? And the becoming of Henry V. I'm going to wrap this in a trilogy. And yes, he makes the Percy rebel, the Harry Hotspur character, younger than he was in real life, so that he can have a counterweight to Prince Hal, two young, energetic men the same age, vying for the next generation. But that's really the 1399s through to that first decade is Henry Bolingbroke, yes, heir to John of Gaunt, and now Henry IV, just kind of dealing with these rebellions. It doesn't have a great sweeping narrative to it until you get to Henry V, who comes in 1413. And, Bolingbroke's reign has a kind of dour demeanor to it, which I think rubbed some people differently to the strange, cheerful countenance of Richard II. I think even after Richard II gets deposed, he's just shuffled from castle to castle until eventually he exits from the scene in 1400.
I'm sorry about that. I had to mute for a bit. I was briefly preoccupied. Anyway,
I'm just trying to illustrate that there's a kind of dour feeling to Henry IV's reign, despite the energy of taking the throne. I can't. I'm sure there's better scholars out there than myself, the sort of layman read of it, but it seems that he is the one who gets the line in Shakespeare that uneasy lies the head that wears the crown, to paraphrase. And yes, it does seem that he inherits that, right? That vigor and that character from 1399 very quickly change once he inherits the throne, and that really actually you're psyching up for the narrative of Henry V to come. That's pretty much what I have to say on sort of the usurpation.
Yeah. Okay. So the usurpation. Oh, did you talk about? I had the family tree here. Did you say so? Henry IV was the son of John of Gaunt and his first wife, Blanche of Lancaster. So that's why it's called the House of Lancaster, because John of Gaunt was the Duke of Lancaster.
Yes.
Yeah.
I didn't explicitly say that. I mean, I'm not sure you have authority to bring up the family tree. I could give it a go on my side.
Yeah, so all right, so moving on from that point, once the king is deposed, and so after the reign of Henry IV, which is relatively, it's not entirely stable, but as you said, he faces rebellions, and it's turbulent. His son is Henry V, and Henry V, of course, is one of the most fabled and greatest military leaders in English history. And you didn't talk about Henry V yet, did you?
No, I was setting it up.
Okay, so Henry V is, of course, known as principally in English history as the victor of the Battle of Agincourt, when in 1415, when he basically invaded France, as the English kings were wont to. They had a traditional claim to the French throne, so he invaded France, fought his way through the country, and eventually reached a point where his soldiers were dying of disease, and supplies were running low, so they turned back. But the French outflanked them and stopped them. As the English tried to ride back to Calais, the French appeared in front of them, and it was something like I don't know, the numbers vary, but it was something like maybe 50,000 French against like 10 to 15,000 English, and the French were essentially decimated on the field by the English longbows, and it became by the weather as well, the muddy field in front of them. They charged forward with their horses, and they were bogged down in the mud and slaughtered. So Henry V is famous for winning this battle and for establishing dominion over France. So, but he died young. He died young in 1422, didn't he?
Yeah.
He died.
So there's a few treaties there. So you got 1415, then he takes rule on about 1418, and it's between 1416 and about 1419. I think Jacob seems to think that Henry is sculpting the idea of exactly what he wants. Initially, he probably just wants Normandy. So it was going to be a campaign in 1411 between the English and the Burgundians, right? There's this whole internal faction thing going on where the Burgundians are against the Armagnacs in the Parisian court, and Burgundy always kind of rubbing up against Paris the wrong way in this century. That England were going to go in with the Burgundians and kind of try and pincer Paris, right? Because they knew Paris had a weak king, again, a theme in Charles VI. So, yeah, early on, it's like, does he just want Normandy? But then by 1419, he's crafted this idea that he will become the heir to Charles VI. And he gets a treaty of Troyes in 1421. So only a year before, I think it's 1421, but it's about a year, it's 2 tops before he dies, that says he will be king of both England and France once Charles VI is dead. And so at that point, it's, for me, narratively, again, you're talking about this idea of like that completes the Plantagenet dream. Almost. Yes. There's nothing more to do except see how it falls apart logistically. Which is kind of what, and that gets exacerbated and front loaded by the fact he dies quickly. But it is interesting just thinking like about the century from a narrative point of view, or about what England had been trying to do for the 100 Years' War, that he achieves it all kind of without the intent of doing so until very late in the day, and then he has to actually rule it. And
yeah, I mean, like he essentially wins. Like I don't know, like people consider the 100 Years' War to last until the fall of the English in France and the fall of this whole Plantagenet setup, the Plantagenet. But in a sense, I mean, Henry V basically wins the 100 Years' War for England. But but of course it wasn't logistically doable from the beginning. Although, actually, do you think that had it been conducted differently, had he survived, would he have been able to rule both kingdoms?
No, I think it's a zenith, and it's undoable. The only way you could rule it, you could possibly rule Normandy, and like France just could completely fracture. That's a possibility. But no, not France. If people have this idea of, there's territories that the Dauphin kept, Languedoc, Poitou, and he had loyal, he had loyal men at his side. That there's no way you can conquer, France to the Mediterranean, or this concept of it.
No.
But he could have completely carved up the kingdom with the Burgundians, and maybe some of the Low Country, like the Flemish, could have come in. And in that sense, yes, it could have been a completely different future, but it's not this future of this clear, crisp King of England and France. I don't see that.
The two kingdoms. Remember in the Second World War when Churchill suggested that maybe, I think he was making a reference to that. But what I find ironic is that it's just at this point that England is becoming more English, like even amongst the nobility, like the 100 Years' War.
That had begun under Edward III, I believe.
It had begun under Edward III, but it had accelerated because of the 100 Years' War, the identity forming, conflicts of the war. It had made England more English, and France more French, and so the English nobility they were starting to use the vernacular, like English, as a court language, I think, by this time, like under the reign of Henry V.
So I was confused about Henry V's ability to speak. So there's this film, right, in 2019, The King. It came out on Netflix. It's actually fairly decent for something Netflix throws out. And it has him speaking French a lot in it. And you can think, oh yeah, that's because they were still kind of French in court. And that's what you think. And you think the film's being clever. But then I was reading this Jacobs book, and he claims that one of the peace treaties, the Pope or some representative, some sort of independent representative, to be present, and they were demanding that the treaty be conducted in Latin, or the talks be conducted in Latin, because he couldn't speak French. And then I was like,
really?
Well, hang on.
I thought Henry V was fluent in French, but he just preferred to speak English.
Maybe that was the ploy. I mean, this is Jacobs writing at the beginning of the 20th century. I'm not sure what the consensus is now, or if that's changed.
Okay. Because in Shakespeare, he definitely.
It did surprise me when I read that.
Yeah, that's odd. I don't see that as. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but it just doesn't seem plausible. Like the English kings spoke, the English nobility and certainly the monarchy spoke French. I mean,
Yeah, no,
at this point, they were
I'll
still
go with the
speaking
assumption
French
he
as a
did.
first language. Like, I mean, right?
Yeah, I would have
Just
thought
at
that
the
as
point,
well.
like Henry the Fourth, Henry the Fourth spoke. I think French was his primary language. Like he probably spoke English with an accent instead of French. But I know that Henry the Fifth. Anyway, whatever it is, Henry the Fifth dies, and so his son, Henry the Sixth, a baby, 9 months old when he died, something like that, is
Yeah, and at
now.
this, so I think August 20, I mean months, right? The calendar year has shifted since, but ostensibly August 1422, Henry V dies, and in October Charles VI dies. So then the treaty comes into effect, and Henry VI becomes king of both England and France, aged about a year. I think he's born in 1421. So yeah, that's the layout. So the French have also lost their mad king. Sorry, go ahead.
Yes, so I guess Henry the Sixth is born into this position where, like, obviously there has to be a regency, and you know, he like from the moment of his birth, you see like the fact that he has to rule over two kingdoms, the fact that he has the legacy of his father, of the victor of Agincourt, to live up to, and the fact that his reign starts with a regency of combating factions. Already sort of like you already think, okay, his reign is going to be doomed. Like England is going to descend into war. It already like the omens are gathering at this point.
Yeah, so I just immediately Henry, there's a sense that that Henry V has entered this. It's almost Roman, right? So this idea they become deified upon their death, and Shakespeare
Yes.
definitely invokes that. How he has Humphrey Duke of Gloucester and Henry VI Part One talk. I think it opens with the corpse of Henry V lying there, and everyone thinking, "Oh God, what next?" And Jacob starts his chapter. So like Jacob's will bring you through the reign of Henry IV after the usurpation, and eventually gets to the chapter of Henry V, and he starts off by saying basically, how do I write about this guy who has become a myth in the minds of my readers before I've even uttered anything, right? He
Yes.
sweeps in like this Indian summer interlude between two chaotic periods. It's how Jacobs describes it. And yeah, so I do think there was probably this instance that immediately he had entered this mythic phase. So he was like a Roman emperor who becomes, they become Quirinius, right? Is it when Romulus, Plutarch Romulus goes away and he gets swept up in this whirlwind is one of the myths, and like swept up into the pantheon of the gods and becomes Romulus Quirinius, some sort of like Mars-like god.
Right.
Sort of fused into the two, and there is that feeling with Henry V immediately. I wouldn't be surprised if and the 1420s are dominated by that feeling in England, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think certainly, like even the there's a line in Shakespeare later on when Richard, I think it's when Richard the Duke of York says to Henry IV, okay, I can't remember the line verbatim, but the essence of it is that he says, if you had lived up to the legend that your father created, if you had been a figure as mythic as he was, then perhaps I wouldn't have pressed my claim to the throne. Like even the families, even the families who had been usurped by his house, worshipped him. I mean, they saw like he sort of transcended Henry V. Henry IV usurped the crown, but Henry V transcended dynastic, jockeying. He was England itself, the shining exemplar, and all the nobility venerated him.
Yeah, it's funny. You do wonder. I mean, after Agincourt, sure, but I was reading up again. So, father of Richard of York was murdered he was actually killed for treason for his being involved in the Southampton plot, which was a plot to murder Henry V in Southampton before he went across to France. And it's expected that there was actually not too much French involvement in this. This was disgruntled England lords from 1399 legacy.
Right, but this is
So,
before his moment
yeah,
came.
yeah, yeah. So it's interesting. Like, I wonder how much in a generation had Richard strayed from his father and his view. Probably quite a lot,
Hmm.
because he fights in France, and it becomes an English thing then, right? I think
Yes.
there's some. It's possibly Henry V's brother gets murdered in Paris or something at some point in this around 1418 or something. And yeah, I think that galvanizes a lot of the English, that they fight in France, and that's what you see in the beginning of the Jones book and in the Henry VI Part 1. Now it's completely ahistorical, okay? Yeah, disclaimer, but Shakespeare wants to give this Englishman marshalling in France. Uh, it's almost poetical how doomed they are. These brave marshals like Talbot, and there's a Delisle in there, and of course Richard
Yes.
um, earns his spurs out there, you could say, and that has to be juxtaposed next. The doomed fate of that has to be juxtaposed next to this quiet, timid Henry VI, and then the shadow is just Henry V constantly over
And of
constantly.
course, the Treaty of Troyes, which is the treaty that disinherits the Dauphin, right? Um, is sort of like, it's almost like it's interesting. It's like a historical precursor to, in my view, like to the treaty between Henry VI and Richard, Duke of York, later on in his reign, when he disinherits his own son. Um, so that when he says when he dies, Richard will become king. That's much later in the War of the Roses. But this type of deal that his father, the great military leader, negotiated and humiliated the House of Valois in France, now happens to his own house in England, in the face of the Yorkist claim. Uh, so that's just fascinating. But I suppose, shall we cover like the bulk of the
Yeah,
reign of
just
Henry?
so there's a tract in Jacob's book called "The Minority of Henry VI," and
Yeah.
it runs from 1422 to 1435, which culminates in this Treaty of Arras, which has the Dauphin triumphant. And in the meantime, you've got Joan of Arc. She rallies
Hmm.
with the Dauphin. There's some victories. I believe I have a slide on that here. So you've got a Battle of Patay, 1429. She is captured by the English, right, and burnt, isn't she, in 1431?
Yeah.
But the Dauphin carries on in strength and actually uses. I'm not sure actually how much retrospectively she becomes the martyr for France, but that's what the English end up doing by having her killed. That she becomes this French martyr who had been visited by angels to save France. So it talk about their narrative of the 15th century.
Yeah.
It overcomes the narrative. So England are left with this Quirinus shadow of Henry V, and then France actually have their counter narrative. And I think it's really interesting to note how powerful Joan of Arc becomes in the counter narrative. And I actually think Shakespeare doesn't know how to treat her at all. She's this kind of
He
very
doesn't.
strange side character.
She's almost
Yeah.
comedic in the way that like
Yes. I think he is
the
trying to make perhaps that London crowd think of
yeah,
her comedic, but it just jars.
it doesn't work because you know that the legacy of Joan of Arc absolutely overwhelms the legacy. Like, which layman even, like, okay, maybe in England they do, certainly, but outside of Britain, there aren't very many laymen who could probably even name Henry V, whereas Joan of Arc has become like one of the great historical figures of Western civilization. So
Yeah.
yeah.
But to get back to this concept of this is the minority. So all this is happening in France, and the best men are in France. And I actually think it was one of the. So if I go back here, originally there's two men, right? Bedford, who dies in 1435 as well, key date. He's the man on the ground in France mainly, and Humphrey Duke of Gloucester becomes not regent, not quite this or that. He spent ages trying to figure out exactly what his title would be and how much money he could get. He gets under pressure. I think in 1428, basically, he's reprimanded in the House of Lords for, misappropriating funds due to the crown and all of this. So I think Bedford's okay abroad, but it's a case of self-interest at home with Gloucester. and he kind of slowly loses power. I think that by the time he exits the scene in 1447, he had lost his power in the court anyway.
Yeah.
But just to give an indication of the two men, I don't know if Jones had a bit on Gloucester. Again, I think I remember
Jones
Shakespeare
covered Gloucester, yeah.
Yeah, what's his opinion on Gloucester? Is he damning of the man? Or?
I mean, he seems to think that Gloucester was sort of a like rash, and you know, he was he was too he had a temper, and he was too dismissive of his enemies. All of that together, yeah.
Yeah, because I looked this up, and maybe I was mistaking Jones with my Shakespeare readings. Like, did Shakespeare treat him in a sort of more pathetic manner? I think he did, but I actually looked up the lines Gloucester gets, and it's not that. It's not a lot, but maybe he just treats him in a bit more pathetic manner, which seems odd. But yeah, I think he probably did misappropriate the funds used out for himself. I mean, you've got this is the problem with a child on the throne. Particularly, it's not even a child on the throne, I think, in the sense of Richard II. It's a newborn babe whose mother has just come over from the French court. It's an extraordinary vacuum of power.
It is.
And then so when Bedford exits in 1435, there's two Somersets, right? There's a first Duke and a second Duke of Somerset. So the first one actually is with Richard, Duke of York, fighting in these 1430s in France. And we're building up to York hating Somerset, basically, which is the rivalry that sets off the Wars of the Roses. And
did you mention the Beaufort as well? The Beaufort.
Yeah, Beaufort is Somerset. Sorry, the Duke of Somerset is Edmund Beaufort.
Right. Yes, he's Edmund Beaufort, but the Cardinal, is the Cardinal his brother or his?
I believe it would be the uncle of the second Duke. He's the brother of the first Duke, is my understanding.
Right. Yes.
Yeah, the Cardinal. Is this the Cardinal? Is the Chancellor? There's so many Beauforts.
Yeah, the Cardinal, who is the principal rival of Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester.
Yes, yeah. They're like setting up traps for each other in London and everything. It just seems ludicrous. While England's losing France, that's what I said. Brave men are in France, dying in their droves, and the petty men are setting up barricades for each other as they try and loot one another in London. That's the impression I get of that Gloucester period. But to set up Somerset with York, Somerset, the first Duke. So on the left panel there, you see the second Duke surrendering Rouen, right? So there's more kind of ignominy due England's way. They lose Rouen, they lose these echoes of Henry V one by one, get ticked off the list. And Charles VII of France now, who self-acclaimed in around 1731, just takes them one by one off of England, who are blundering the inheritance of Henry V. We've already talked about that inheritance, but they are blundering it nonetheless. And so, yeah, the first Duke comes over to be a commander in France, and I think that's when you see the Somerset-York rivalry come in, where Jacobs maintains that York just has a look at Somerset and just cannot believe he's become a commander in France. He's just not up to it, and he's a blundering idiot, basically. And then he dies in 1440, and his son sort of inherits that sort of position of influence, I suppose.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm wondering if there's a description of Suffolk. You carry on if you want to interject there.
Yeah. So I'm just going. So I think 1437 is when Henry turns 16, and that's sort of the age of majority, the age of manhood at that time. Bedford had died in 1435. So William de la Pole, Earl of Suffolk, he became one of the dominant personalities of the royal
as far
court.
as I can tell, though, he's big at this point just by having survived. Like, he's an old hand. He remembers the siege of Harfleur and all of this.
Yes, he was. Well, okay, I don't remember how old he was at this point. He was born 1396, so
Yeah, he's one of the older guys we're talking about around here.
yeah, he is. So he's one of the, yeah, exactly, one of the veterans, as it were. Um, and so he I think the reason there was a rivalry was because Richard wanted to fight, or sorry, yeah, the Yorks wanted to fight, whereas the Beauforts and Suffolk wanted a diplomatic solution, right?
Suffolk, I think, to Jacobs puts in this like that. To his credit, he only said the game was up with France when it really was up, and that there was no point spending more money and blood on it. I think that's now Suffolk comes to that conclusion quite late.
Well,
Trying to figure out
he
exactly
comes to
when.
that conclusion around like like what, like late 1430s, I thought, early 1440s, like that's sort of, I don't know. I mean, that is late if you look at the death of
Yes,
Henry
I
V.
think so.
So
I mean, yes,
yeah,
and there's this whole play of York is there when they lose Normandy because there was a political decision to try and keep Gascony, right, so in around Bordeaux and these ports
yes,
to prioritize Gascony over Normandy. I think York thinks that was a strategic blunder, which probably was when you consider the south coast of England and all of that. Probably easier to ship people over to Normandy, but there was a lot of support for the English in Gascony, I think. So there was a decision made to prioritize Gascony and they lost Normandy. But I believe that Suffolk's one, yeah, no, you're right. It is the 1430s. I thought it could have been the 1440s. Suffolk had grown tired of England's French delusion, is what Jacobs calls it, in the 1430s.
yes. And
And
so,
then,
and
yeah, 1440s is the rise of Somerset. Sorry, carry on.
Gloucester and York both a continued wanted to continue fighting in France. They wanted to continue hemorrhaging blood and treasure, trying to keep these cities as they gradually fell to the Dauphin. Uh, and so this was the main genesis of the conflict between York and Suffolk. Um, so so I guess you could, in modern terms, it would be like Suffolk was the dove and York and Gloucester were the hawks. Suffolk and the Beauforts were the doves, and York and Gloucester were the hawks. And I guess doves and hawks were the origin of the fractures that led to the Wars of the Roses. Uh, so you know he continued. Okay, what was the treaty in 1444? The Treaty of Tours,
So
right?
there's basically a truce for 5 years between 1444 and 1449.
Right, right.
Now
And he also
Somerset
negotiated
is
the
lieutenant
marriage
of
of
France for
Suffolk
that
too.
time. Somerset, who's a bumbling idiot according to Jacobs, is in the battlefield anyway,
Uh-huh.
is lieutenant for France. So he gets to put in the years without getting much experience. You could say.
I remember, so Suffolk negotiates the marriage to Henry VI of Margaret of Anjou, who's related to the previous king, but not not significantly, and she wasn't very wealthy either. Or at least I remember Shakespeare
No,
says that. So
I
what was the purpose of this
I can't
negotiation?
get my head around that. Is that a blunder? Because you look at her where she comes from. Okay, born into the Duchy of Lorraine. Yes, it's the House of Valois Anjou, so it's kind of Valois House, but second eldest daughter to Renee. I think it's a blunder,
Is it the
of a
territory
match.
maybe? Like would he get, I mean, maybe he would get like the allyship of the duchy of, was Anjou a strategically important duchy?
The Anjous were did they prefer the Dauphin or Henry? I believe that they were, yeah, they were always Dauphin loyal. So I suppose it was try and win over the heartland of so they were like Dukes of Orleans and that sort of
And
area.
Maine maybe. Yeah.
So it's kind of heartland France, I suppose, just to try and keep a peace. I think it was to try and keep a peace near borders of places they still had. She was a child, and she was 15 when she came across, and is being used by the French to get an ear in the English court, particularly the impressionable ear of Henry VI. And I
Uh-huh.
think there's letters from 1447 of her, or I can't remember if they're to her by the French court or back, telling her basically to get the ear in Henry VI and get him to acquiesce to a lot of what they.
There were
would like.
clauses in the treaty apparently relating to the the giving up of certain parts of territory to France, wasn't there?
Yeah, I mean, the marriage becomes synonymous with signing a peace treaty for a war you've lost. And I think that's what's important for her reign. It's forever tainted by that juxtaposition.
Right. And I guess it's different because when Henry V married the daughter of Charles VII, right? Was it the daughter? No. Who was it?
Yeah, Catherine.
Yeah, Catherine.
Catherine Valois.
She's like, Catherine de Valois is sort of like the French bride, but taken from the French court. Like, this is an English triumph. She's like a spoil of war. Whereas in this case, Margaret of Anjou,
she's the afters.
Yes.
That's the impression I get. They are being bartered to an extent. If you've won a war, you get your prize. Now, I think Henry V didn't get a dowry from the French court because he saw as dowry the inheritance of France. Mm-hmm. But other than that, yes, it's a conquest. Whereas Margaret is defeat.
Yes, yeah, it's capitulation, exactly, or at least in the mind of the English nobility. That's how they saw it. I mean, Suffolk probably saw it as a necessary. I'm not sure if Suffolk saw that England was. I mean, at this point, England hadn't yet retreated entirely from French lands, had they? It was still in the midst of a treaty. I mean, maybe he was just trying to suit
I think the
situation.
The real ends come. So you've got when you gear up to 1450. I think what's notable at this point is Henry VI has come of age. He's about the same age as what he's older now in the 1440s than what Edward IV will be at the Battle of Towton. And he's still acting like he forever will act like he's in his minority. And he lives to be 50, right? Of course, he has those strict lapses into insanity in 1454 and 1455. But where is he in the 1440s? These colleges are founded under him. He was said to have been pious. But
Eton and Westminster.
King's College, Cambridge, Eton. Yeah. A couple of the, ironically, places that would go on to be completely define, English hierarchical breeding and rearing for duty and service to the crown was founded by a man who couldn't have held his crown in a more pathetic manner.
One of his hobby horses was education. I mean, he was like a scholarly king, and so he wanted very much to.
That's the sympathetic reading, isn't it? Scholarly king in a time of war, sort of thing.
Yes, that's the sympathetic. But I think he was genuinely committed to it. And actually, he started Eton as a college for poor scholars to be sent if they couldn't afford to be educated otherwise. It was like this is like the king's school, who's using his generosity to educate boys who wouldn't be able to get educated otherwise, and then ends up becoming exactly the opposite. It ends up, over the years becomes the breeding ground of the aristocracy. I just thought that's pretty funny.
Yeah, it's pretty ironic, right? But I want to gear up to this moment in 1450, the murder of Suffolk. So Suffolk gets done for treason. I think it's just basically seen as a botched job of France. He becomes a scapegoat along with the Chancellor at the time, someone called Mellis or something like this. Do I have his name? Mullins. Sorry. Yeah.
Mullins.
Yeah. So Mullins resigns and Suffolk tries to flee at some point. I can't remember fully the details of that. Like he flees, and
Gloucester was also arrested.
Well, Gloucester's dead by that point. Gloucester's dead by 1447.
Yes, Gloucester died in prison. Like he died without awaiting trial. Anyway, sorry. Yes, carry on.
Yeah. So, but it's very shady. I don't think anyone really knows because the picture on this right is a later, I think it's a 19th century drawing based on the murder of Suffolk in 1450, where he's fleeing. I think he's trying to get across the channel to France. And apparently it's just pirates wanting his ransom. And somehow there's a botch job. Maybe he struggled and he dies. It's very difficult to know who was behind that order. Like, what was it? Just these rogue pirate actors? It seems a very strange episode in all of this. But what it does is it knocks Richard, Duke of York, and Warwick with him, right? The Nevilles, straight into seeing that they should be next for manipulating Henry, I think. And then that's where 1450s take on a completely new gear, because at the start, Bordeaux is taken, I think 1451, and Gascony is lost, and the last bits of that French enterprise is gone. And so it's really only open for the men who fought in France, who had that energy and that will to enact a strong government in England and strong leadership in England, to do so. I think a lot of the other guys are out of the way, bar, of course, Beaufort, Somerset, right? And that's what leads to the traditional beginning of Wars of Roses in 1455.
Yep, I guess so. So I just want to see if there are any important, like, so between 1450 and 1455, we see that Somerset and the Queen, and the Cardinal. Wait, actually, was the Cardinal still alive at this point, or had he been replaced?
Cardinal Beaufort had certainly exited the scene. I think he dies in the 1440s.
Okay, yeah. So then
1447 is his term ended as Archbishop of Canterbury. Yeah, he's dead in 1447.
There was Beaufort and the Queen, and when so the king's son is born in 1453, Edward.
Yeah, I don't know he's one of these enigmatic characters. I think we can get back to him later as he matures.
Yeah, we can, but I just want to say that, first of all, some people suspected that Edward was actually the son of Somerset and the Queen rather than Henry.
Because how could Henry was even fit to copulate, sort of thing.
Yes, precisely, and because of how close Somerset and Margaret seem to be.
Yeah, that's something I'll obviously rankle with the Yorkists, right? This incompetence in Somerset, who's overseen the destruction, now conniving with the Queen from France, who's not even an attractive queen in terms of her family for any strategic purposes. And yeah, I mean, that'll just, of course, I don't know. That's, you can see how that rumor spreads. I don't know if there's any credence to it.
Right. And so, and
it will lead up to the illness, and then Richard taking the throne.
Let's say, the illness. So I guess, like, Henry is having less and less to do with the day-to-day governance. Actually, even though he's reached his majority, he's not really governing the kingdom. And apparently, and especially militarily, like his almost total, absence of leadership in that department, basically casts a pall over the entire English enterprise in France. And the same year that Henry's son is born, 1453, the English suffer a major defeat in France. And I think, it's at this point that England retreats, and the only thing that's left to them is Calais. So France has won, and this was decisive. So it's also like, that's symbolic of the son, the suspected bastard son is born in the same year as the Battle of Castillon, in which the entire English yoke is removed from France, and they're left gripping the port of Calais desperately. And then, so he'd created sort of an unstable situation. There was a lack of authority. There was a power vacuum that was growing, and there were there was the Percy Neville feud, and then the Bonvilles as well. So there was a volatile situation, I guess, and then so at this point he's sunk into it. Okay, so do you want to talk about the instability, the mental instability a little bit? What was wrong? And when did he have his first breakdown? Actually, was it in 1453 or was it when was that?
So that's the first proper breakdown where he becomes non-responsive. Is that correct? I'm skeptical, as I said, of how quiet he is throughout the 1440s. The fact that there's this rumor about whether he's the father of his own child.
Yeah.
That it for me, it doesn't strike as a cliff edge insanity, but that it's a particular nasty period where he when you don't even get any responses from the king, it forces the hand of the court to have to elect a leader or a regent.
So yeah, so then a regency council or a regency, whatever it's called, is established. Similarly to how it would have been established.
Yeah, it's a big echo to me with the Bolingbroke this moment.
Yeah. And the Queen was very much opposed to this because she knew that the Regency Council would be dominated by factions.
Also, sorry, just interject in terms of like historically shifting moments. Constantinople has fallen at this time.
Yes, 1453. Yeah. It was yeah. So he had his first mental breakdown where he's unresponsive. His son is born. The English get thrown from France in the Battle of Castillon, holding on only to Calais, and Constantinople falls. So it's a very eventful year. And you can see like how Constantinople at this point, I feel like for the English nobility is almost like obviously the news echoes around Europe, but for them, like it's a background question for them. Like
I think that's a part of why Englishmen today don't have a good sense of it, is because they're taught Wars of the Roses into the Tudors so much at school. Or you could argue probably how much is the next gen going to get taught anything, but ostensibly that's the classic thing that gets drilled into them, and so that's their vision of the 15th century. It's very English focused, a little bit of France and how you're losing it, and it just gets lost in that noise.
Yeah, it's fascinating because the religious question in the 1400s almost entirely vanishes in to be replaced by the dynastic question, and then you have sort of the dynastic and the religious question coming to a head in the 1500s with Henry VIII and all of that, and then the 1600s are almost entirely religious. So it's like, but yeah, I mean, for now, the whole idea of Christendom falling to the Muslims in the East is not even like the English nobility isn't thinking about this in the slightest.
No.
They're gearing up for war, and the Regency Council is created, and Richard, the Duke of York, becomes its head, Lord Protector, in 1454. And
again, echoing something will happen 200 years later. The Lord Protector has certain images to it. Anyway, carry on.
He does, and then the Earl of Salisbury also gets an important position. I don't remember what it was. Maybe it was Lord.
Salisbury is also Neville. I think he's a brother of Richard Neville, Duke of York. Maybe he's his uncle. The Nevilles are an interesting family. They've gained a lot of wealth by this point through all of the turmoil we've talked about since 1399. So Richard Neville's grandfather, Ralph Neville, had like 12 kids or something, and he starts this pseudo dynasty, and a lot of the wealth does go to Richard, and that's why he can find himself in a position of kingmaker. But it's interesting, there's this rise of the Nevilles, and the network game they play with marriages in England is done very well, and it's a case study in how to do it well these times.
And so then the Percys are shunted aside, and they're furious, but since Richard has backed the Nevilles, he gains Salisbury's son, the Earl of Warwick, who was an extremely important, extremely wealthy, as you said.
Sorry, he's the son, the first Earl of Salisbury.
And nobleman, and he becomes. Is Warwick on the council as well, the Regency Council, or is that just Salisbury? Well,
I'm unsure in particular, because this council, right, it's suddenly know what to do when Henry VI comes back too, right?
Yes. Yeah, so they established this council, but then shortly, like almost like a few months or a year later, uh, Henry makes a recovery, and the Regency Council is
Again, I'm very
immediately.
skeptical about these recoveries and these lapses. Like,
Like, what do you think? Are you saying that in fact they were like he was like they suppressed him and then he gained the upper hand again, or what?
uh, not probably not that far. I'd say he goes into some psychotic depression mode where he doesn't talk to anyone. But it's when he's lucid, I'm skeptical of how lucid he is, particularly as a ruler.
Oh, so you think this is just the factions, like the Queen's factions, gaining the upper hand or something like that?
Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah, kind of. It's difficult to know. I just don't fully understand how
Maybe he just
suddenly he's okay
wasn't.
again, and here, yeah, let's listen to him again.
Well, it's like, I mean, almost like George III, how he went in and out of his.
It's interesting, yeah, and people think it's inherited from Charles VI, who thought it was made of glass. And you see, the Henry VI, the idea that's inherited from Charles VI would be his grandfather on the mother's side.
Yes.
I Again, people have studied this better than me, but they don't strike me as similar. Maybe I'm wrong on that.
What was it
I think
like?
Charles VI didn't have these quiet, like he thought he was made of glass, and I think he was a bit more obviously stark raving mad.
Mhm.
Whereas Henry, even when he's lucid, it's the lucid moments for Henry that just make me think, how big are these differences really between when he's completely okay, when he's quiet, he's not saying a thing, sure, but I just don't think they're enormous changes in character. That's all I want to say.
Um, okay, so
Yeah, I don't know,
okay,
between
Richard is
1455 and
exiled.
1460. What? Yeah, with this sort of
Why
exiled,
is why is
sent up
Richard
north.
exiled? Like, is he exiled because
I don't think he
uh
didn't want to relinquish the power. Right. Again,
yeah,
this is a
probably
question of
that's what it
how
was.
lucid is Henry VI. He's probably muttered some stuff about founding new schools, but Richard doesn't think that that's going to cut the mustard. But um, yeah, I think, but that's what this is a complete. Who sends him up there? I'm a bit sketchy on this, but him and I suppose they just get out. Right, this is
Him,
sort of
Warwick,
England.
Salisbury.
Yeah, if you get out in time, you can rally your base
Hmm.
up north, and that's really what they do until 1460, unless I'm mistaken. Perhaps you
Yeah,
can lead me into that.
they escape from London, and basically they gather they call their banners. So in 1460, no, sorry, Battle of St. Albans, we forgot about this. So
The first battle
Richard,
of St. Albans, yeah.
the first Battle of St. Albans gathers about like 5,000 troops and marches towards London. And Henry, the king's forces and his goal at this point was not to take the crown. His goal was to, I think he said, to remove the evil counselors who surrounded Henry, to free the king
Mm.
from his evil influences. This was his goal. So
Yeah, I think it's similar to, we've seen this played before, right? Bolingbroke didn't want the
yes.
crown until he did. Henry V didn't want the crown of France until he did. You kind of
Mhm.
play your hand, and you see how well wars are going, and then you change your objectives. I think that's it. He's going in with flexible objectives.
Yes, but I think York had always nursed a sort of maybe a sort of resentment that his family had been, that he
There
should
is
be.
a fueling hatred of the Somersets, of course. Yeah.
Yes. So there was the battle, and the Yorkists won. They definitely won that battle. They outnumbered. I think their forces outnumbered Henry's by like 2 times or something. And
I read in Jacobs he claims only 50 people died in this battle, and that it was barely, you could barely consider it a battle. It's just that the
yeah,
Duke of Somerset is one of those 50, so it's quite consequential.
it is quite consequential. And Henry VI is taken prisoner at this point, isn't he? Um, and uh, and so and then the Yorkists once more, they're come into ascendancy, and the court again. Henry's advisors, his litany of advisors begins to be packed once more by Yorkist allies, and York again becomes Lord Protector, appointed by Parliament. So yeah,
Yeah.
so
Then, so by the time he's by the time we get to Wakefield in 1460, though, he has been up north conspiring with the Nevilles for a while. So there is another change there. It's like, again, yes, there's the death of Somerset, then Henry comes back to lucidity. I'm skeptical of that. I think it's, yeah, there's factions, right? But is it, but when he gets exiled and we're leading up to the Battle of Wakefield in 1460, is there any major event we're missing there between 14?
40. Oh yeah. So I think so. So, okay, let's see. So, so Warwick during this time becomes more influential under the Yorkist faction, and then and Warwick develops a more personal enmity with Margaret of Anjou. So. And then at this point, Henry again has another one of his bouts of insanity, and then he supposedly recovers and once again relieves York of his duties as Lord Protector. And this happens between 1455 and 1460, and
Looks like there's in England in absolute chaos at this point.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And he's trying to, so either Henry or the Queen's factions, whoever it is, are trying to restore order. They're trying to bring back a sense of peace to the realm because war is definitely in the air. And
are you more sympathetic to one side at this point, this sort of Richard of York play, or the?
Well, okay,
one finds themselves sympathetic to York, I think. I mean, just because there is this idea that he's staring at dysfunction and trying to, like, again, you can, these tales are so old.
Do you see York as staring at dysfunction and trying to stabilize England? Or do you see York as simply an avaricious man who wants the crown for himself and doesn't care about the rest?
Both, but what was Bolingbroke? He strikes me as a more competent man than the Somersets or anything in the Lancastrian.
I see Bolingbroke as much more sympathetic than Richard.
Okay.
You know,
I would probably equate them.
Okay, I see. I just think that, like, I'm not exactly sympathetic to Henry VI. He was an ineffective king, but you know, Richard didn't have to. I feel like Richard was the main, like, he could have been conciliatory towards the Queen's faction. They could have actually had a successful regency. They didn't have to. I think Richard's personal ambitions ended up overwhelming anything else to do with his desire for stability. And I feel like he was the one who sort of caused, like, I don't think Margaret of Anjou was the principal catalyst for the wars. If you're going to look at one person, I think it was Richard, Duke of York.
Fair. But okay, yeah. So he dies in Wakefield. And then I'm very impressed in the 1460-61 transition of the Yorkists. I mean, I assume that's Warwick, the kingmaker, and this Neville network. Because if Richard is the figurehead and he's gone in 1460, to have the Battle of Towton in 1461 and to straight away have Edward of York is going to become Edward IV as king within a year is a very impressive turnaround. Of course, that Battle of Towton is said to be one of the biggest. Let me just move some of these slides. Have some Anjou here. Here's Richard, the two Richards, and then Towton, right? So it was said to be the biggest battlefield the biggest battle in terms of men on the field of England ever. Though obviously records are disputed. I think I don't have much to say on a military historian, or I haven't even read too much into the military campaigns of this from that perspective. But it strikes me as very impressive from a logistical point of view to be able to deal with the loss of Richard in 1460 and turn it around in a year. I think there is this real energy to Edward IV.
There is definitely.
Like the bright sun, the sort of savior figure. More so than there is that comes later with Henry Tudor. Like Henry Tudor, I think it's kind of like it just comes out of nowhere, and the narrative is crafted after. Where there is this real feeling when you read the events that lead to the rise of Edward, that is this narrative happening in real time. This is a man proving himself. I think he's 18 at the Battle of Towton.
And by this point, Richard has already claimed the throne already. So Edward, of course, at Richard's death at Wakefield, inherits his claim to the throne, and so it continues. I mean, at this point, he's at open rebellion with the crown.
Yeah.
And so
I don't have anything to say between the Wakefield Town and those years. Obviously, Henry VI is left like fleeing to Bamber at that point, Bamber Castle. Flees north.
Yeah.
He's trying to flee north to Scotland.
Yes, there's the Battle of Mortimer's Cross. That was a defeat of the Lancastrian armies. And
so between 61 and 64, the Yorkists haven't they're not stably in charge, but they're snuffing out the Lancastrians.
They're snuffing out, and actually, Sir Owen Tudor, an interesting figure, is actually captured at the Battle of Mortimer's Cross and executed by the Yorkists. Now, do you want to talk about Owen Tudor now or later on?
I'll let you go into Owen Tudor. Other than, I think the Tudors, they had some affiliation with Owen Glendower at the beginning of the century as a family. There was an Ap Tudor involved in that.
In the rebellions, yeah. They had associated with the local Welsh princes, they had been in rebellion, and Sir Owen Tudor was actually the second husband of Catherine of Valois. Catherine of Valois, that is the wife of Henry V, because Henry V had died young, and so, she'd been looking for a husband.
It's always interesting what to do with these women after. So I was reading in the 1400s, they send Isabel of France, who was Richard II's wife, back to France. It's interesting how Catherine sticks around. I suppose she's not of the deposed queen, but she had barely been married to Henry, so it is interesting. She had to rear the child. Around. That's right. It's a child. That's the clinching difference, right?
But she was also the wife of like a conqueror. Like at this point, is the house of? I mean, her brother.
But her brother does become Charles VII, so it's difficult, right?
Her brother becomes Charles VII. So at this point, is she? Do you think it would have been wiser for her to return? Would her brother have accepted her back into the court? I mean, she was basically.
No, I think it's in the whims of like the. It probably strikes well to her character, or at least coy. I don't know if that's the right word. Shrewd, I suppose, that she knew how to play the English court, so that it never becomes a point of contention. Really, it doesn't seem to strike so. Yeah, sorry, that's funny point.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting reflection on her character. But she marries. She was going to marry, I think, a member of the Beaufort family. I think it was, but this was prevented by the anti-Beaufort faction, and so eventually she ends up going for Owen Tudor, who's so he's from this Welsh family, a history of rebellions. He's a courtier, but he's basically like a squire. He's he's just some low status chap that is a member of the household of either it was one of the Beauforts or someone who was close to Catherine, and thus he developed a personal relationship with her, got married with her in secret, so it wasn't public knowledge really. But over the years, I mean, she obviously had many children, and so, well, I don't remember how many, but she had a number of children, maybe 4 children in 5 years, something like that, or at least 4 pregnancies, 2 of whom, Edmund and Jasper, survived. And so obviously the court was aware that she had married this guy, but the general public was not. And the anti-Beaufort factions were furious because Tudor was close to Beaufort, and it was, they thought, and now there were these 2 direct descendants of King. No, actually, sorry, not of any king, just of the kings of the Valois. But they had some Plantagenet blood in their veins. So in Dan Jones's book, there's a chapter that starts off with Owen Tudor trying to flee England upon the death of Catherine of Valois, and he's captured and returned to England. And there are several. He's not executed though, but his sons flee to some convent, Barking Abbey or something, and they become dukes of whatever, and they're sort of silent for a number of years. And then in 1461, Owen Tudor is executed on the battlefield, but his sons are still alive, and they're in some abbey, either in Wales or in the marches somewhere, just on the sidelines, and not even, no one's thinking about them really very much. Okay, so 61 to 64. Have we covered that adequately?
Yeah, I think 64, where there's this interesting play on where Edward marries Elizabeth Woodville, and
yes,
it begins the Warwick schism,
and that pisses off
so
Warwick.
this has been played. It's been played by numerous books and historical fiction, and sometimes actual historians. It's like again, like so many parts of Edward's life read like this novel, that he gets mesmerized by this woman who's older than him, divorcee, Lancastrian, with children, and it completely ruptures with Warwick, Warwick Kingmaker, what his aspirations were. But Jacobs downplays that a little bit, and he says, yes, Woodville, Warwick wasn't happy with it, but it's not just because of Woodville. It's not like this. She came in and you have rumors of this working some magic potion charm over Edward or something in the 15th century. I'm sure that would have been around court gossip, but it's actually just Warwick and Edward, right? As you say, there's that quick, or well, I say, there's a quick turnaround, 1460-61, between the death of the father and the victory of the son at Towton. Warwick has had very little time to actually communicate to Edward about what a peace means, and Edward is still rash, and the pair of them are pretty obdurate. At least they strike me as that. And yeah, Jacobs puts it down to just that neither of them had communicated to the peace. It happens to be Woodville, but their visions for England are actually quite different. And he plays this foreign policy place. And this is where between 1464 and 1467, there's this the foreign policy stuff gets more and more wide. Whereas Warwick was going for the traditional play of marrying off someone in France. Yeah. Yes. Whereas Edward seems to want to team up again with old alliances, which had worked in the 1411s, right? He fancies himself as another Harry V. Yes. And he says, well, in the 1410s, there was the Burgundy-England alliance, pincer movement on Paris, bring in the Low Countries. That seems to be far more the strategy Edward wanted to go for. And so I think he just wanted to stamp his own authority out, of course. But really if the two of them had that differing vision, Woodville is the catalyst, but is not a deterministic, or is not the bolt from the blue sort of woman woos him and suddenly this great vision of the piece is gone. That's not that true. That's how Jacob plays it, and I think that's actually I've seen depictions of War of the Roses in sort of cinematic style stuff that try and play Woodville to that extent.
Well, but Warwick also loses influence significantly as a result of it's not just Elizabeth Woodville, but it's the whole.
He grows to hate the Woodvilles. Yeah, he grows to hate the whole family.
Earl, Rivers.
Yeah,
and they supported. Edward wanted an alliance with Burgundy, right? Burgundy.
Yeah. So Burgundy are always at odds with Paris, right?
Always, yeah. And Burgundy, just as a sort of a fact, had been previously the territory of England under Edward III, right? Was it Burgundy? No, that was Bordeaux. Never mind.
No. That's Bordeaux and Gascony. They would have been allies. Burgundy borders the Rhine, right? It was the kind of middle Frankish kingdom.
Yes.
Of the 800s, and so it has this independent spirit, even though it's ostensibly absorbed into France at this point.
Mm-hmm. Did they have their own dialect?
Yes.
Do they still?
They were Burgundian, right? No, all the French dialects got more or less wiped out with after the Revolution, and they had that one French language pushed, like Languedoc became the universal French, and Languedoc was a very prominent accent and sort of semi offshoot language that just kind of got wiped out after the revolution because they had that vision of one language.
They say that aspects of like old Norman French are preserved in Quebec because they
didn't get that diktat on high from post-revolutionary France. Didn't hit Quebec.
It didn't. So a lot of the swear words in Quebec are ecclesiastical, whereas they don't use ecclesiastical swear words in France at all. Anymore. Now it's just like, whatever, putain, merde, stuff like that. But in Quebec, they'll still say things like tabarnak or whatever it is, which are all based upon the church. So just an interesting bit of trivia. Anyway, so 1467, no, 60s.
Yeah, 67 is when, by that time Warwick is just, he's distasteful. He has a distaste for the Woodville family's success. And by 1469, now this is a decade, right? I think it's a slow brew on Warwick and the Nevilles. And he had inherited this great Neville network. And again, kind of like a lower level of Henry V, had achieved all of his aims as kingmaker, and then sees them kind of unwind.
He'd also courted the enmity of his brother. A tricky one, by the way, George, Duke of Clarence, right? George, Duke of Clarence was...
Well, he had married into the Nevilles, hadn't he?
No, I think he was going to marry... Like, he was going to marry Warwick's eldest daughter, Isabel Neville. Yes, he was going to marry into the Nevilles, but the king banned it. He
probably would have seen that Warwick was thinking, can I replace this guy with can I replace Edward with a new breed?
But the Duke of Clarence was very angry at his brother's interference.
Clarence it strikes me as quite petulant character. Sort of always upset he was born second.
Yes, definitely.
They are their father's sons, all three of them.
Definitely, they all are. Even Richard.
It comes out a little bit later, but it's there.
So,
but I want to sort of say that in 1460s, that in the Jacobs book that I'd forgotten, maybe Jones does state this. It's been a while since I'd read that book. Louis XI, right? So Charles VII has exited the scene. It's Louis XI now as King of France. He doesn't listen to pleas from Margaret of Anjou because, well, first of all, when she's pleading, it's kind of the civil war isn't settled, and it suits Louis that England is fighting with itself.
Mm-hmm.
But by 1469, Louis XI was offering Warwick to team up with him, and maybe put himself on the throne, maybe find someone else. From Louis' perspective, he didn't really care. To say basically, stop Edward IV having any pretensions to want to regain territory in France, with dangling the idea that Warwick could have principality in Holland or Zeeland. So, Neville Warwick, same person, going into alliance with Anjou is always, again, treated as this complete turnaround in all these fictional adaptations or semi-fictional historical fiction adaptations, but they tend to treat that whole decade in an episode or in a scene. So I don't believe, I think that pressure when the King of France is on you, and Neville's an ambitious man, and he perhaps sees the Woodvilles playing the same game as what the Nevilles had played 2 generations earlier that his grandfather had managed to do in turbulent times since 1399. I think it's the power of the voice of the King of France and the baubles he can offer you. So, and that he ruminates on that for a while, then goes in with Margaret of Anjou because she still has the son, of course.
Indeed.
Or into 1470, yeah.
Into 1470, but in 14, we have to remember that Warwick and Clarence are in the meantime sort of provoking and funding and giving rise to a number of different sort of minor rebellions across the land, which Edward then has to put down. And he goes around and he succeeds. He ends up putting down all the rebellions, but he's like he was puzzled as to why these happened in such quick succession, and eventually it's revealed that Warwick and Clarence were the ones who were provoking them. And I think so then Warwick fell out of favor, but they weren't punished in any other way. Like he didn't draw up a bill of attainder or behead those two, or anything like that. They just sort of, it was just like, oh, I don't know what his personal reaction to it was, but it didn't seem like he in my opinion, if he wanted to move against them, this was the moment to do it, but he didn't do so. He left them in place, which allowed.
Yeah, I can only put that down to arrogance or complacency at this point.
Yeah, I guess so. Like maybe he thought, oh, like I just reconcile with them and then they'll, like, maybe he just thought it was momentary discontent or something. But no, I mean, once he figured out that they were definitely, or at least there was strong evidence that they were complicit in these rebellions, he should have done something, but he didn't. So Louis XI then encourages a reconciliation between Warwick. So then Warwick flees to France, right? Does he flee to France?
Yeah, I think ostensibly. I don't know how obvious it is that he's fled, that he's going to meet up with Margaret of Anjou, but yeah, he is in France.
Right.
So her little court of exile, he goes to meet up with her. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And previously a fervent rival of Margaret, meets up in her court and, encouraged by Louis XI, and actually, is Anjou sheltering in Burgundy or in France?
I'm not sure at this point. Doesn't she? I assume she moved around.
Yeah, she probably did.
Looking for help, right? Whoever can help her.
But the French say, all right, you guys should reunite. Then Warwick can join the Lancastrian.
Louis just wants to keep the war going.
Yeah. Oh, exactly.
Keep them all busy with each other.
Keep them all busy with each other, and it's sort of reminiscent of the way that Louis XIV tried to continue encouraging the Catholic Protestant factions in their scuffles and in their fights during like after the Restoration, when he kept sort of encouraging James. But anyway, but it is reminiscent of that. The French always want England to be preoccupied, and England often takes the bait. So
that is a recurring story of this of the 15th century, and this chaos is how insular it is to certain regards.
Yeah,
like the English vision, so insular compared to where she ends up in the 19th century. It's a complete chaos and collapse of the Plantagenet vision, and then like a real starting to have to form a new narrative, and can only be able to do so through carnage. Really.
Mm-hmm. So Warwick agrees to marry his child. Okay, so he agrees to a marriage to Edward, the son of Henry VI, marry his daughter to Edward. So he sort of signs his pact with blood, and now he's definitely a part of the Lancastrian faction, indubitably. And so then he decides to invade England in support of Henry VI, and the Duke of Clarence joins him. And so he starts in the north. Him and Clarence, actually, no. Did they start? Well, I don't remember where exactly they invaded, but they either invaded from the north or invaded from like Dartmouth.
I think Edward is abroad, either in, I can't remember if he's in the Low Countries or if he's in Northern England. London is open, and so he's able to take Henry in a coup, take London and get Henry VI out of the Tower and put him back on the throne.
Yep.
But another thing that struck me as I was reading these is how often the king is not. It is not a London-centric England at all. It has the Tower there, but throughout the 15th century, and
Parliament as well. No, actually, Parliament opened a different.
Moved.
You're right. Yeah, it moved. I forgot. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm back. Yeah, Parliament moves all the time.
Yes.
parliaments in Leicester, there's parliaments in Coventry, there's parliaments all around the Midlands. So, yeah, it strikes me as like it's such a less London-centric world that taking London, obviously it's bad reflection on Edward, but it's probably not as bad as what you originally think when you read it when you're a bit younger. Yeah. And like so London is a fortress because of the tower, right? That's the formidable building that is in London at this time.
Yes, that principally it's the tower, and well, I mean, it's also like the richest city, but I mean, you're right. The main, the main structure there is definitely the tower. And then they had, and I guess they had the Palace of, actually, did they have the Palace of Whitehall there at the time? Or was that
Whitehall? Later? It was a Palace of, Westminster. It was a sort of dual city. Like you wouldn't strategically defend the thing as a unit.
But the king was also crowned at London, was he not?
Oh yeah, no, like it was the capital. It's not a madly London-centric world.
Oh, you're right.
In the same sense that I think emerges in the subsequent centuries.
Yeah, he went on. They always went on tours. They had parliaments in different places. No, it was. I
know Henry VIII still went on tours as well. He sort of planned. He's planned summer tours and stuff to see the people. That would have been. It's much more prevalent. It's a very different sort of culture, I think, than you expect. Because you hear about as well. You can mistake this with the popularization of the Wars of the Roses that happen in the Game of Thrones worlds, right? Where he centers it very 20th century style with a clear, distinct capital. And they don't. Whoever's in the throne doesn't move much from there. It's like the idea of being on the throne is literally sitting on the throne in the capital. But that's just not the world that is actually unfolding here in the 15th century as I read through it. That's just an observation I had that was interesting, just how often parliaments are elsewhere.
I think actually Johnson was considering moving the Lords to Manchester, but then decided not to. Anyway, so...
He considered a lot of things and then didn't do them.
Yes. Yes. Of course. So...
We're 1470, 1471.
So they've reestablished Henry VI on the throne. But Edward is not... Okay, actually, another thing I wanted to say about Edward is that he decided not to kill Henry earlier on. I mean, he thought, okay, he's a weak and effeminate king. People don't like him. We'll just hold him up in the tower and it'll be fine. Was that also, along with his mistake of not moving against his brother in 1469, was it also a mistake not to kill Henry before?
There is a ruthlessness to Richard III to come that does not seem to be fully there with Edward. Edward still, to me, is this larger-than-life figure. And included in his want to be Harry V and all of these old, English kings, these great English kings, is that Order of the Garter, Edward III, chivalric code to a certain extent, right? At least that's how he's justifying it himself. And I think Henry VI is too tragic a figure. I mean, he's like... So he does eventually die in 1471, right? Which starts off everything again. Mm-hmm. But he'd be 50. Remember, he was born in 1421, the year before the death of Henry V.
Yeah.
Way back. So I just think it's too depressing, and there's a little bit of Edward that is he'll kill on the battlefield, and he's great on the battlefield. I think we've seen people that have a modern version of this, with this sort of temperament, that they can be absolutely lethal on the modern equivalent is the sports field, right? Usually, and they can. But then sometimes in peacetime, they're actually quite passive figures. They're quite not. I don't think Edward's entirely passive, but just they're not killers in their day-to-day life. The field of battle. They take on a different persona. And so that's what I see when I see reading.
No one hated Henry VI. Like everyone just sort of they had contempt for his effeminacy. They also sort of pitied him. Like they didn't blame like how like when they thought of they blamed England's ills on Henry VI infirmities, but they didn't they didn't harbor hatred towards Henry VI as a result. They almost saw him as this, like, they just thought, oh, what a poor, insane, book like king. We just have to, like, he's not
Should have been a
made for
monk.
the
Yeah,
throne.
certainly.
He's made to be a monk. Like, why would we kill him? Like, why would we murder him? He's not
And
deserving.
he was very pious, and you have to remember there was an underlying belief in God, and all of them had it.
Yeah,
and so I think his piety.
He was regarded almost as like a saint in
yeah.
Like, yeah.
There would have been reservations about doing it.
And so once Henry VI is reestablished, Edward, so the Duke of Clarence becomes a favored figure at court because he betrayed his brother, and so at this time, but the regime was unstable because Warwick and Clarence were not strong enough, and nor were they trustworthy enough to hold the realm on their own. Like, Henry needed a solid base of allies that weren't simply backstabbers and fortune seekers. Now, the Duke of Somerset, who was the Beaufort family.
Whoever succeeded the second Duke there in 1455.
I think he disliked Warwick because he thought that the first Duke of Somerset had perished as a result of. I mean, he held Warwick responsible.
Which was true.
Yeah, certainly. So there began this internal dispute because now Warwick, who was in ascendancy and in favor, were involved in a dispute with the Beauforts, so that they couldn't seek the Beauforts as allies. So Warwick and Clarence were sort of on their own. They were just like floating in an island with the rest of the English nobility roiling about, and wanting to depose them. And so Edward, I think, originally fled to France or maybe Burgundy, and then returned, and he landed in Yorkshire, and the Earl of the Percys, I think, joined him, the Northumberlands, and some others. They marched towards London, and Warwick was... Clarence once more betrayed Henry VI, joined his brother again, abandoned Warwick, and Edward's army took London, and Henry was sent to the Tower again. So
where he dies shortly after, right?
Where he dies, and there are rumors that he was in fact assassinated this time around.
Yeah, I mean,
there are signs that his corpse might have been bludgeoned to death.
Is this where there is? It could have been Richard without the orders of Edward, as in Richard of York, future Richard III.
Oh yes, I hadn't heard that. But,
no, I mean like we're inventing history here. We're trying to create characters, but you can see it.
you can actually. That's fascinating.
But yeah, sorry, carry on. I just when does Clarence meet his end? Because it's hilarious.
So Warwick is killed in the battle for London.
Barnet, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And
1471. Oh yeah. And then you have Margaret. He has to deal with the loose end of Margaret of Anjou and her son. They flee into the West Country, right? And that's where you have the kind of final battle before this. I treat the whole Bosworth thing as this crazy addendum. It's kind of like someone doing this mad last chapter.
Yeah, it's how
it's like a bonus track
as well. Like the whole thing ends with Richard III on the throne of England, and then this sort of like yes, and then this as an addendum, Bosworth happens and totally changes the track of English history. Completely.
Do you have anything to say of Tewkesbury? Because this is where Edward of Anjou, Margaret's son, and son of Henry VI, dies. He's in battle. I think he's only 18 at that point. Makes sense. Yeah, he's about 18. So about the same age Edward was 10 years earlier.
Mm-hmm. So Margaret, so Margaret had raised the army, and
Should
Where
support
did,
in the West, I think, isn't it? Like, you have the Tudors and the Welsh seem to be the West Country, the marshes.
right?
I don't know.
Yes.
She's
Recruits
heading
from the Wealth
Tewkesbury.
March. They landed at Weymouth. Is that how you say it?
Yeah, Weymouth, yeah.
Yeah. So in 1471, yes, he found their army. Edward found the army at Tewkesbury in May and defeated it. I don't know if he crushed the army, but he certainly defeated it. And Edward of Westminster, that's who he was. He was the son of Henry VI. Finally dies, killed by the Duke of Clarence's men, and the Duke of Somerset was also killed in this battle.
Yeah, Clarence is utterly contemptible as a character.
He is. He is.
Which is why I don't know what happens in the 1470s to him, because does he last until 1478? George Duke of Clarence, right?
Yeah.
He was famously.
So it continues. Like, okay, so no, because he doesn't die at this battle. So
yeah, he has 8 years left in him.
Yeah, after Tewkesbury, and after Barnet and Tewkesbury happen, Edward wins.
Yeah, I'll carry on here. It's just the reason I juxtapose it in is because Jacobs puts in Clarence's fate very close after he's talking about Tewkesbury. He says, Clarence was a nuisance rather than a great danger, even though son-in-law to Warwick. But his opposition to Edward and Gloucester and his fostering of local rebellion could not be tolerated. He had few friends. He was out of touch with the atmosphere of the court. I'm just going through how Jacobs describes Clarence. Because when Jacobs goes through Tewkesbury 1471, he immediately gives this paragraph about Clarence. Right? He was out of touch with the atmosphere of the court, unacceptable to the dominant household clique, creatures and followers of Hastings. Death was perhaps too severe a medicine. I don't think it was, to be honest, not in the times. But in 1478, there were no places of honourable quasi-banishment sufficiently remote to be of use. Clarence was already the king's lieutenant in Ireland, but Ireland was too close for safety. But I don't know what he's done between 1471 and 1478 to make Edward finally flip the switch on him.
Like, I don't. Here's the thing. Like, okay. So Edward, when he first deposes Henry VI, all right, Clarence helps him, fine. He rewards him. Clarence becomes the clear cause of rebellions under Edward. Edward doesn't move against him. Clarence joins Edward's enemies, crowns Henry VI once more. Edward defeats Henry VI by encouraging Clarence to join him again. So at this point, do you think that because Clarence joined him again, and how actually arguably one of the decisive factors in overthrowing Henry VI the second time, do you think that Edward at this point had a duty to reward him and to place some degree of trust in him?
It's just interesting how 7 years pass before he apparently drowns in a vat of Malmsey wine, for those who don't know, which is just the best description of
I remember hearing of
death ever. I think in some of the, again, these TV adaptations and whatever, they have the brothers hoist him and dunk him in themselves. Yeah. But it's just such a great ending. People always include it for the visuals. But I don't get why 7 years passed between Tewkesbury and that. He must have been skirmishing again. He must have been getting itchy feet.
Yeah, they were. There was a worsening feud between the two. He continued to. He wasn't happy under the reign of his brother. He continued to feud with him, and I think he fell out of favor once more. And he was. Oh, yeah. He was. Wait. Hang on. He was imprisoned, wasn't he? Wasn't he sent to the Tower?
But then why after 7 years?
Because
I'm not demanding you answer to me. It's just something strange that points out in the narrative.
I thought it was another plot against his.
Yeah, I'm sure it was.
Yeah, he died in the Tower of London.
Yeah.
Here it is. So let me just. I searched this one up. He was imprisoned in the Tower of London and put on trial for treason against his brother Edward VI because apparently he was involved in yet another plot to attempt to overthrow him, and he was not.
Count
Oh,
of Nevada, Malmsey wine, give it to me. That's the ending I want.
yeah, okay. So apparently Edward himself, prosecutor's brother, demanded that Parliament pass a bill of attainder against him,
Yeah.
and declared that he was guilty of unnatural, loathly treasons, which were aggravated by the fact that he was his brother. Yes, multiple treasons, of course. And following his conviction and attainder, he was privately executed at the Tower. By tradition, at the Boyer Tower, and soon after the event, a rumor spread that he had been drowned in a vat of Malmsey wine.
Yes, that's pure narrative. That's why people love this episode of England. Even though, as I say, actually, from an English historical point of view, it's completely tragic. Unless you do what the Tudors do and you spin this sort of Arthurian myth of a king out of Wales or a prince out of Wales, which to their credit is a very good narrative spin to put on it. But in terms of the Game of Thrones style plot, A to B, it's just full of these images,
yeah,
and betrayals, and then double betrayals. But yeah, I'd carry on. I don't know if there's much to say of the 1470s, really, this more latter part of Edward's reign. Or do you have anything to say on Edward of Anjou? Strikes me as quite an enigmatic character, never really got to lay his stamp on the world. That's how the dice roll in battle, I suppose.
Well, but it was a peaceful reign. He didn't really, I think he signed a treaty with France. No, he invaded France and then signed a treaty with them and withdrew. Another failed invasion.
But I think you kind of have to do that in order to show your prominence. Again, let's go back to Henry V. He's not looking to become king of France at the start. In fact, a lot of the reason why he goes to France is because, first of all, his father was going to do it. You'd had the Percy rebellions. It's a way of uniting your home front and showing you can actually be a king on the international stage. Right. So going there, getting a peace, probably not great peace, sorry, nothing to write home about, but it's better than it's better in the eyes of your court and your peers immediately below you as king that you be seen to do this.
And indeed, and even if you knew that it was likely going to fail.
Yeah, this is the last throes of this sort of playbook which had been occurring in England for centuries. Henry VIII will try it, the very last one, because the new dynamic that will emerge in the next century is the New World and the rise of the Habsburgs. Once you've twinned the Spanish crown rather with Holy Roman Emperor, and then suddenly the whole idea of going to France, it just doesn't make sense geopolitically in the same way anymore. So it's a last throw.
And the Catholic Protestant issue totally takes over in England after that point. Yeah. Like France is seen as like the papist enclave, whereas England is seen as a Protestant bastion, and so that complicates it as well. Like,
yeah, I'm sure we'll get to that subsequent.
We will. But and another failed military venture, 1482. Edward attempts an invasion of Scotland, but has to withdraw back to England, and ultimately unsuccessful.
I think the luster had gone out of him at that point. I mean,
yeah,
you could say peaked soon. It's funny, the analogy that the battlefield is like the sports field of today. Obviously, it's more brutal, and there are real world consequences. You don't have like pampered sports that starts getting paid millions, but stakes are higher. All this, but something you see
diving to the ground after being
but something you see a lot is that if a young player bursts onto the scene and can peak, their career peaks. It doesn't follow a normal trajectory. They can't maintain that constancy. And I think that happens a lot with Edward on the battlefield, like Towton at 18. He just peaks very early and he can't maintain the 1482 campaign. It doesn't surprise me. They only last a year later than that, right? He's gone in 1483.
Mm-hmm.
So that doesn't.
He dies around Easter. He dies around Easter and names his brother Richard. Now this is the thing. Richard didn't have to take this position in the subsequent factional feuds after his death. He was given this position by his brother on his deathbed, Lord Protector, for Edward's 12-year-old son, 12. Edward V.
You see, 12 is very different to Henry VI at 1 that we had way back. Yeah.
12 is very different, but he's still a child. He's not 14. I think if you were 14, it would be even more different. But at 12, it's still... So Richard is Lord Protector. So why do you think... I mean, Richard was not never seemed.
He's the loyal one, right?
Yeah, he's the loyal
Until
one.
he's not.
George was the disloyal one. Like, why did his character? I mean, what happened to him? Like,
Yeah,
why?
it's difficult. Like if you wrote this in a novel, from what I've read and seen about it, it's a volte face, or however you pronounce that, a sort of about face. It would.
Oh, volte-face. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. In writing terms, it would strike me as too abrupt a change in character. Like you'd actually want to need into that and flex and show signs of this change, or signs that he'd always harnessed something secretly because of the lack of documents. It's absolutely true that he always did, or sorry, it's absolutely possible that he always did. So I think it looks more abrupt just because of a lack of documentation.
Definitely.
He seems to possess shrewd cunning, all of the attributes, all of the ambition of Duke of Clarence, but a complete 180 in terms of attributes about how to go about it.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And so he becomes the Lord Protector. And
it's also a brilliant like three-son analogy, or not analogy, but just almost archetype. These three sons of York.
Yes.
That you have the guy who peaks at 18 on the battlefield, becomes king, overcomes everything, including his brother.
And before
you actually have the two treacherous brothers. You got carry on.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say the father who made his claim but was never able to consummate it, and then his sons, his second son, his first son, loyally carrying this on at 18, being as you said, the shining light of the family, the luster of England.
Yeah, and then the two treacherous brothers, one in broad daylight, naked, clumsy almost, whereas the other one is
lurking in the shadows.
Yeah.
I just think almost the way that the Duke of Clarence kept going back and forth and back again almost strikes me as like something that Shakespeare would have just invented, but he didn't. Like, this is actually something that happened. Like, he just kept moving back and forth. I find that absolutely befuddling. Like, I just don't understand it. Even Warwick, after he betrayed
Clarence is just like a vaunting, vainglorious man bound for the vat or something. That's why his ending in a vat of wine. I just find it hilarious.
It's so fitting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's see.
Anyway, Richard and I mean, I always find this jarring. These years, 1483 to 85, Richard's reign. I don't know what to make of it, to be honest. It's too short to get a proper judge of him as a king, and that's often said about him. And I think that's the correct assessment. I don't know if you agree with that.
It is too. Although it's very chilling that as soon as he's Lord Protector, and then Edward V becomes king, but shortly thereafter, he disappears. Like,
what does Dan Jones say on this? Because that as a historian must be quite difficult to document.
Yeah, this is
because he hushed it up very, very. Again, he was very thorough, I think, in how he dealt with this. Historians today don't have many documentations to point at one another. I remember I was in the Tower of London last summer, May 21, I think. And you can go up the steps, and they claim like this is the steps where he hid the children in the tower. They were under the step. And in the 20th century, I think somebody found some skeletal remains, and then this is them, and it's dubious whether it's them or someone else who was in the tower. They claimed it was like a child skeleton or something. So I finally found what happened to the. So it's this ongoing thing. He covered it up so well, did Richard, that you can walk over those steps and you're meant to feel this haunting presence or this chill. And he enters the pantheon of great villains thereby. I mean, Laurence Olivier and the rest.
Richard was crowned Duke of Gloucester first before becoming king.
Yes.
And so apparently, okay, this is what Jones says. Okay, so what happened was that they were going to present the new king at Stony Stratford, 18 miles south along the old Roman road that cut diagonally across the middle of England. So it would have taken 3 hours or so to cover the ground for the presentation, but the journey was never completed because Gloucester suddenly drew up with his soldiers, told Earl Rivers and Grey that they were under arrest, and commanded them to be led as prisoners to the north of England. And then Gloucester and Buckingham, who had allied himself with him, basically took hold of the king and said, "You're ours now."
Yeah, it's a trademark coup with the trademark notations. I think even in the 1790s, when Napoleon is having his coup on the consulate to become first consular, I can't remember exactly the terms, the directorate maybe it is. When Roberts gets to that chapter of his Napoleon biography, it's like everything was written down on scraps of paper and then immediately burnt. Yeah. So as a historian, it's very difficult to actually unfold, and that's why you can always tell when the historian has these little sketchy details to go off, and they're scrapping together bits of burnt manuscript or something. it's the sign of a well-planned coup, and it's a tight group. I mean, that Buckingham guy, Richard would have to have trusted him entirely in the process. But yeah, it's a coup. He gets a taste for being king and wants to keep it. That is the Yorkist downfall. That's their attribute. They can't stand aside. Yeah,
they can't. And Richard at this point sets about to clear the Woodvilles from power. And so him and Buckingham purge the Woodville faction from the court and imprison or execute them. And of course, this is the new Duke of Gloucester, and he's very reminiscent. Duke of Gloucester, Lord Protector, reminiscent of the old Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester.
Yeah.
And in the same way, he had the same vaulting ambition and the same almost rashness and the same, character traits. But this time, but at that time, Humphrey was beset by other factions who were constraining him, and he had to operate within a much different environment. Richard at this point had taken complete control of the realm. He had the utter power to do what he wished, and so he set about just sweeping people from power and just destroying the power bases of anyone who could have opposed him. And so he was in total control at this point. This is what Jones is saying, comparing the two characters, whereas Humphrey had never gotten into that position where he had his full grip on the court, whereas at this point Richard does. And
Richard strikes me as a much more effective maneuverer of the court than Humphrey.
Yes, most definitely.
I mean, you can say that court is exhausted, and there is a point of exhaustion when you reach Richard. That when you're reading the narrative, you just go, again, really? And at least that's how I find it when you hit the 1480s. Someone else just let this settle down for a while.
Richard at one point summons a jury. He summons like the council to a meeting at the Tower of London at 10 o'clock in the morning, as was their custom. And then a few of the men enter, and these were men who could have threatened Richard's position. Immediately, as soon as they entered the room, they were executed by Buckingham's soldiers. They were just attacked and brutally murdered, butchered. And Richard doesn't care. Like he's not going to attempt to do this any other way. Like he is butchering, imprisoning, and murdering anyone who steps in his way. And Jones says it was a summary execution, the most breathtaking ruthlessness. Like Buckingham was literally hiding behind a tapestry or something with his soldiers, and as soon as the council men rush in, they're just chopped to pieces. So it works, and then I'm just trying to get
blunt when it gets to the action. Like Richard, you can see how he's echoed down the ages of this English villain par excellence. This sort of haunting figure. Tell your children Richard would come after you at night if they misbehaved, sort of thing. if this ruthlessness.
It truly, and finally, Edward and Richard, Duke of York, the two sons of Edward IV, are proclaimed by Buckingham and Richard to be bastards, on the grounds that the court, or just a theologian, Dr. Ralph Shaw, appeared at Paul's Cross, I'm quoting from Dan Jones, St. Paul's Cross, to preach the extraordinary and wholly specious message that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been undertaken while Edward was already contracted to marry someone else, Lady Eleanor Butler, the daughter of the great Lancastrian soldier John Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury. On these grounds, Shaw argued, Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, were illegitimate, and therefore the former could not be allowed to take the throne. Instead, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who was said to bear an unmistakable physical resemblance to his father, the Duke of York, to take the throne in the place of his nephew. Buckingham then declared that the two princes were bastards. They disappeared into the Tower, and the following day, Richard III was crowned as king.
So, does Jones say they're effectively, and this is very interesting, that Richard hires a sort of cornerside quack to spread the news among the commons?
Yeah.
Is that what? Yeah.
I think are you talking about the theologian, or who?
Yes.
I thought you.
Yes. The theologian.
Yes. He. This is the man who.
I like this idea. Like, it's very clever that you plant this seed, and then the groundswell of opinion comes from that, rather than you as the authority reading it, the declaration, crowning yourself. I think Richard of York played a similar game in the 1450s, where he comes up with these ideas which would give him all of the power, but he wouldn't effectively become king. When he's trying to take the reins over Henry VI, and his fallback to, well, I didn't propose myself, did I? No, but it's gearing you towards that. It's this indirect method. It's very well employed. I think actually you see a lot of that today throughout the 20th century. It's sort of funny. Roberts has come out with a new book on, is it Northcliffe? Who was the big press baron?
Owner of the Daily Mail.
Yeah, Lord Northcliffe. That since you have that mail and that press, like, you release these news, that the press has become that theologian, right? You release this news to the public, let them think they've thought of it themselves, and then the groundswell of opinion comes back, and then you say, well, yes, you've heard the rumors, so I'm going to act on them. Very clever by Richard. Yeah, very well played.
Yeah, this is the old press, and so Richard is crowned king, and I love the way that Jones describes it. He says, on Sunday, the 6th of July, 1483, Gloucester and his wife Anne Neville celebrated Mass at Westminster and were crowned, and a feast was celebrated with all circumstances thereunto belonging. The new king was enthroned on a chair with cushions of cloth of gold. They go down, his ears rang with the rich sound of trumpets and the playing of minstrels, some of them brought to England from as far away as Rome. Following the service in the abbey, the new king dined on 46 different dishes, including beef and mutton, roast crane and peacock, oranges and quinces. And then he held an audience with the nobles, who he had summoned to witness his usurpation, and commanded them to return to their shires in peace and see that order was kept and no extortions committed against his subjects. And he was king.
I want to read out this passage quickly. Sorry, it was a little bit of a juxtaposition of between Edward and Richard. So Richard, they dug up the skeleton recently, and they think he may have actually had a hump or a limp walk or something. His spine wasn't perfect. Now, obviously, that got exaggerated in the tales, I'd say, but it doesn't seem like it was entirely fabricated. But there was this piece in Jacobs's book that says, the genial and affable king, talking of Edward, has been the subject of no contemporary portrait by 15th century English writers, saving only the second continuator of the Croyland Chronicle. It is to Sir Thomas More and Polydore Virgil, I'm not sure who that is, we all know Thomas More, who must have known people that either saw or knew Edward, that recourse must be had for an estimate. These give a view scarcely possible to contemporaries. More to contrast, Edward with Richard III always in his mind. This is More, right? Thomas More calls him princely to behold, a man of heart, courageous, politique, in council, in adversary, nothing abashed, in peace just and merciful, in war sharp and fierce, in field bold and hardy, and nadeless no farther than wisdom would adventurous. That, in comparison to the image of Richard we're always sold, of this devious, lurching figure, almost duplicitous, definitely.
He's definitely
You
and
could
the
just
way that he
stone cold stare sort of figure. Like you look in your eye, you wouldn't know he was thinking about murdering you in a second.
it's true. Well, austere in a sense, but he dined on 46 different dishes at his coronation.
Well, you have to have the pomp at some point.
You do.
So anyway, I don't know the build up to Bosworth. If you have anything on that, just to round off.
Yeah, sure. So,
because as you say, it comes in at left field. Like Richard was meant to win that battle, right?
Now, do you think, first of all, do you think that Richard himself killed his nephews, like considering his character?
Or yeah, he had it ordered, probably through about 5 different indirect people, so it could never come back to him. But yeah, surely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. No, that's what
he covered his tracks. True, like many indirect. I'd say, yeah, there's a change.
Well, he covered his tracks, but no one was fooled. Like that's the thing.
No, well, obviously no one was fooled. Like it's just too convenient.
It is. Maybe he should have, and I guess he learned from his brother. Like his brother kept the Henry VI in the Tower for years, and that was like a constant festering issue because the king was still alive. I guess like maybe he wasn't as personally ruthless as people imagined him. Maybe he just thought he was taking the necessary steps at this point to secure his throne and not make the mistakes of his brother.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of throughout this 15th century. It's funny, you see a lot of not learning, echoes, we call them, occurring again and again.
Yes.
Like there's this English character to be embroiled in this feud for a century, for the greater part of it. Richard does seem to have learned something. I'm not sure it's the lessons for an everlasting peace, but he seems to have learned how to act decisively and remain quiet. Astute is the attribute, really, which you don't really see out of the Yorkists or a lot of the people we've covered ground on this evening. So to that extent, he did seem to learn something, yeah.
So then Dan Jones
he also knows that the son is a York, right? So he's going to be the same again. Eddie the Fifth, that is, yeah.
Yes.
So this guy grows up, it'll be just the same. Yeah.
And Jones basically says, in fact, there were some indications that Richard may not have been an entirely bad king. He says like, he was sympathetic to the plight of the poor, and he gave grants to them. He was even like personally, like after his initial bout of ruthlessness, he seemed to be a merciful and
he's ruthless against
king.
Those who can threaten his position. You can be a great king to the commons.
Oh, you can. See,
ruthless against your fellow elites or your court. Yeah.
Yeah, and so it doesn't seem like he was just this brutal psychopath that just decided to. I know, because the way he came to power is reminiscent of that, like extreme.
He would have grown up in bloody. His whole world. This is why I said we're generations deep into it at this point. His whole world would have been an understanding how courts work was a bloody barbaric route to the top.
Right, and he felt like
how he
he
learned and understood.
Survivor, every man for himself type of thing, I guess.
Yeah. I was saying he was taking lessons. I just don't think they're necessarily always the right ones.
So there were a few rebellions attempting to remove the princes from the tower and everything. Those rebellions were quashed, but it seemed as though so at a certain point Buckingham defects, and I'm not sure exactly why. Like I can't find the point here.
He probably starts to fear for himself.
Yeah, probably. Like I don't know where the personal break came, but Buckingham basically defects, and in
84 would be or something. Can't be that long after, because Bosworth creeps up in 85. So
yeah. So apparently, Richard was crowned in 83, right? He was crowned in 83.
We barely get a taste of him, really.
So in that year itself, October 1483, Buckingham defected against the king he had helped to create, joined a rebellion of former associates of the old King Edward IV, and switched his allegiance to the only candidate for kingship still alive and even vaguely possible, Henry Tudor. Henry Tudor, of course, was
complete Hail Mary.
a complete Hail Mary, who was the son of Edmund, who had been the son of Owen Tudor and Catherine de Valois. So he says, it was a sure sign of the woe that had befallen the English crown that anyone should ever have considered Henry Tudor as a potential king. His father Edmund had been a half-brother of King Henry VI, and his mother Margaret Beaufort had a small measure of Plantagenet blood in her veins. In ordinary circumstances, these facts would hardly have amounted to a strong dynastic claim to the kingship, and yet it did. He was basically, the way Jones interprets it is that Richard III's usurpation of the crown, his setting in motion once more of a dynastic conflict, which Edward IV had seemed to finally quell with the final defeat of the Lancastrians, basically removed all rules that the nobility might have followed, and that England might have gotten used to once again had Richard III been allowed to reign for longer. But because of the nature of his usurpation, it already set in motion. Basically, people are like, okay, well, we can, if Richard wants to take the crown like this, then we can take the crown from him in any way that we want.
Yeah, and it's a very good foil for the Bolingbroke 1399 case.
Oh yes.
It's a very different seizure of the crown. This one's full of absurdities and sort of, it's like after the long course of the 15th century in England, you've got this warped view of crown seizure, and everyone's suddenly very horrified from it. The dawn breaks on Buckingham and this lot, really.
And it's fascinating because, well, he says that, whereas adult kings such as Edward II and Richard II had been forced from the throne as punishment for long and tyrannous misrule, Henry VI's inanity had eventually led the nobility to oppose him, and then Edward V. But whereas Edward V, the son of Edward IV, had done nothing wrong. He had never demonstrated. He was only 12. He was well educated. He was an intelligent boy. He was expected to be a great prince. There were no health issues. He was not mentally weak. He seemed like he was growing into like a proper prince. And Richard just decided to put him in the Tower and execute him for no reason other than the fact that he wanted the crown more than his nephew did. So this was what really pissed off the nobility. It really set this series of events in motion where they're like, all right, well, this is illegitimate in every manner. And so, and because all the heirs to the throne had died, and Richard they saw as illegitimate, they decided to go back to the one of the most distant descendants of John of Gaunt, who was Henry Tudor. And the idea being, if Richard could seize the crown, why should it not in turn be seized from him? And so that's the idea. So Henry Tudor initially tried to organize a rebellion with the help of the Duke of Buckingham, but they were defeated. Richard III defeated them. Now, do you have this in the? Did you read about this part or
the Jacobs? No, you're gonna have to lead on with the Bosworth piece. I mean,
okay, so this isn't Bosworth. This is so basically they tried to organize a rebellion, and Buckingham did his best to raise an army from his lands in South Wales, but he was hampered by abysmal weather, and he also tried to, because Kent was a region which is constantly in rebellion. Like the men of Kent always were up for a fight, so he tried to, along with his Welsh soldiers, he tried to rouse the men of Kent, which he succeeded in doing, but they rebelled too early, and they were crushed by the Duke of Norfolk, Thomas Howard, who becomes more important, or at least
the Howards are enormously important later on.
So there are all these local risings that are crushed. Buckingham is captured and executed, and Henry Tudor flees the country, and so he's basically on but his mother is still keeping him informed of events in England, and he's basically looking for a second chance to see when he could invade, right? And so I don't remember exactly how he landed. Like, you see, this is the part. Okay, so I know of Bosworth itself, but in the lead up to Bosworth, I think Henry landed at this point, Henry was openly declaring himself the King of England. And he landed in either in Wales or somewhere in the south of England, and he certainly the Welshmen certainly supported him, and so he marched from Wales through England to the field of Bosworth with these men that he had gathered.
Yeah, and that's where the Prince of Wales, myth comes.
Yeah, precisely. And basically, he had landed with a small force, but as he kept marching, more and more men kept defecting to his side, and so his army was swollen by the time all types of political outcasts and people who were opposed to Richard joined him. So in January 1484, Richard III called his first parliament and used it to deliver a full-scale attack on his enemies. And tried to secure the reign of his son, Edward, the Prince of Wales, his son also named Edward. But his son, who's named Edward, died at the age of 10. So he didn't have an heir at this point. And now Henry Tudor comes in at this precise moment, at this convenient moment at Bosworth. And so his son died the same year that he called Parliament to try to secure his place as the heir. And Richard at this point was launched into sort of a pitch of desperation. He found it essential. He needed to capture Henry Tudor and execute him because Tudor's popularity was growing, and purely because of the fact that he was the only Lancastrian descendant, whereas Richard's popularity was waning, and it had already been low since the beginning because of what he had done to his nephews, and now because his only heir was dead. So the King of England attempted...
Yeah, it's a bit ominous for the Tories right now, isn't it? 12 years plus of power, and they start killing each other.
Yes.
Yeah, the people don't end up liking that. Mm-hmm. They'll choose something else.
Yes, I suppose so. So the Tudors had established a court of exiles, and this was before they established a court of exiles in France, and then Jasper Tudor, Henry's uncle, began sort of the first movement across the sea into England, and the French government had been tolerant of the Tudors. They did not.
They probably didn't see them as realistic candidates, but
yeah,
whatever.
They just accepted them. They're like, okay, you can have your court of exiles here, whatever it is. And Richard it was irksome because Richard obviously had this thorn in his side of Henry across the water with the French sustaining him, and I just like the point. I can't get to the. I'm trying to find the point where he enters England, but I just don't remember at which point it was.
England or Wales now? Because
Wales, sorry, yeah.
Henry started from the mouth of the Seine on the 1st of August and arrived at Milford Haven on the 7th, is what Jacobs has. He had received the information he needed from Morgan of Kidwelly, the lawyer, that Rhys ap Thomas, grandson of Rhys, or Griffith ap Nicholas, and Sir John Savage were devoted to his cause. So that's what I have. Milford Haven is a classic landing point. I think that's where Richard II comes in 1399 to realize he's lost his crown. So there's a...
Here I have it. So they land in Wales, and they land in the same valley that had in Owen Glyndwr's day been the rebel capital of the whole country.
Yeah.
And this
Pembrokeshire, South Wales.
Yeah, precisely. And
I actually want to get to Milford Haven at one point. It'll probably be underwhelming, but it's got a lot of historic landings on it.
No, it does. Yeah, you should have a look at it. I certainly will at some point. Okay, so Jones describes. So Henry starts marching through Wales, and Jones describes him. He says he was of all the men and women who had fought for the English crown during the struggles of the century, perhaps none was less familiar to the majority of that crown's subjects than Henry Tudor. A thin face with high cheekbones framed a long, thin nose, a feature shared by his mother, Margaret Beaufort. Round, somewhat hooded eyes formed a tight triangle with his thin, downward-sloping mouth, and dark, wavy hair tumbled down almost to his shoulders. Having barely lived in England, he preferred to speak French, but he had already adopted the style and bearing of a crowned king, and his letters calling for support suggest that he was more than comfortable in the language of imperious persuasion, that was expected of all English monarchs. A man who is barely known to the people of England, barely known to the English nobility, a Welshman who speaks French and had lived in France most of his life, appears in the country as the last Lancastrian descendant. Certainly a fortuitous time, and he obviously planned for it that way. And but in the beginning, people are like, who is this guy? So when he first arrived, there was a very small trickle of reinforcements that flowed to his side. But he rode through the mountains, and word reached Richard III that the attack had finally arrived, the attack from the court in exile of this Welshman. And Henry was in, so in Nottinghamshire, Richard was in Nottinghamshire, and he thought, okay, we're going to, finally, they've arrived. And he was sort of happy. He's like, at last, this moment of anxiety is going to pass, and we can defeat them. And the Tudors came down out of the Welsh mountain into England, and they first arrived at Shrewsbury. The bailiff basically initially lowered the portcullis against them, and then eventually let them pass. And little by little, Henry was slowly gaining momentum. The nobility was the Earl of Oxford joined, John de Vere. If you'll notice, my profile picture is the other one, Shakespeare. At least I think so.
Believer in that.
I am. So finally, Richard had basically, as Jones says, somehow scrambled together an army from Nottingham to Leicester, described as greater than had ever been seen before in England, collected together in behalf of one person. And he rode out of Leicester at the head of his army, amid the greatest pomp, with mighty lords, knights, and esquires, together with a countless multitude of the common people. That's a quote from the Chronicle. And he rode west towards the place where his scouts told him Henry Tudor was waiting. And
you can get a feel the way Jones writes there.
Yeah, he writes it again like a thriller, like it really is, like it's like you're reading a novel rather than a history. It's quite good, I have to say. And maybe it's to do with the fact that he isn't a professional historian, but or at least, sorry, he's a professional historian, but not an academic historian. That's what it is. And so they meet at Bosworth, and the enemy is spotted. They spotted the enemy as the morning light rose. The Richard's army spotted Henry, and they had already gotten into battle formation, and they were marching across the cornfields that lay between Henry and Richard. So Richard's men are like, holy shit, like they're already marching. We need to get into position. So they scrambled into position. They were badly arrayed. They were arranged in a single line. They stretched out for miles, and there were royal gunners who began to fire, but the rebels were simply better organized. So basically what happened was that they caught them unawares in the morning, and the rebels' vanguard was led by the Earl of Oxford. And
don't we have the switch of the Stanleys is often considered critical?
Yes, the Stanleys decided to switch. Sorry, that was earlier when the Tudors descended out of the mountain of Wales. The Stanleys declared for them, and that was absolutely critical. Lord Stanley and actually, is this the same Lord Stanley that became the Governor General? The same family that eventually became Governor Generals of Canada? I don't remember, but anyway, the Stanleys declared for Tudor, and Jones says what occurred subsequently is hard to piece together. So he says Henry's vanguard under Oxford used the marshiest part of the field as a natural defense on their right flank and came up upon the royal vanguard as they ran down Ambion Hill, and the two vanguards crashed into one another, and there was a bunch of hand-to-hand fighting. Oxford had ordered the rebel troops to fight in tight clusters no more than 10 foot from the standards, and this caused some confusion to their enemies. And then Henry Tudor and his personal guard were still bunched in a small group below his rival royal standard, and Richard saw Henry Tudor with his men and decided to charge at him personally. He was a lunatic charge. Yeah. A lunatic charge. Richard was not a physical coward. Never, you could never accuse him of such a thing. Unlike maybe Henry VI, like Richard was a true, but he was a battlefield king to the point of insanity.
It seems insane.
he slammed, his crown was still on top of his helmet. He struck his horse with his spurs, charged around the side of the vanguard, and slammed into Henry's men with lethal speed. His assault caused such terror and damage to the rebel leader that his standard bearer was killed, and the standard that marked out the commander's position was hurled to the ground. And he actually could have killed Henry here. That's what they're saying. Like, they're saying his charge was so brutal and fast that he startled the standard bearers that were surrounding Henry, and it was possible to kill him, and even if he had died himself. But Henry clung on, and so his men were trying to fight off Richard, and seeing that he was in trouble, Sir William Stanley charged his reserve army into the melee, casting. Oh, okay, so here, William Stanley was not. I was wrong. They didn't declare for the Tudor. I thought they declared for the Tudors.
Yeah, he waits and watches the battle.
He waits and watches. Yeah. Sorry, I think I probably just remembered incorrectly. He was waiting and watching, and then at the last possible moment, when he saw that Richard assaulting Henry's men, for some reason decided to side with Henry, and his men, 3,000 freshmen, poured onto the field and scattered the royal army and overwhelmed Richard.
I'd say he wanted to side with the Tudors all along. It's just he is going to play it not as aggressively as Richard with his charge. He was going to wait and see if the battle had been a. He probably was like, well, I don't like Richard, but who is this new up and comer? So I'll wait and see how the battle goes.
Richard seems to have removed his helmet during the battle, which cost him his life. He was struck by several glancing blows.
I'd say it turned so he couldn't see. Usually could have happened to him.
Yeah.
The heat of the battle, right?
Yeah, probably. And he died from a heavy blow to the top of the head, a pointed blade which pierced his skull right through, and then a large chunk of the base of his skull fell off, opening a huge wound and killed him instantly. So he was killed fighting, like true battlefield king,
like a true 15th century English nobleman.
the chronicler,
absolutely brutally,
whatever his name was, a king of England slain in a pitched battle in his own kingdom.
Yeah, that must be who
the time of King Harold,
who Jacobs was referencing in Virgil.
Yeah. Since the time of King Harold, king of England in his own kingdom had not died in battle. So they had participated in battles, but this was like this had been unheard of since the Norman conquest, essentially.
And that's why it feels like such a great reset. I'm sorry to use that phrase, but an actual reset on English history, similar to the Norman conquest.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, it really echoes that, like and King Harold was also like a pretty rash and insane king that tried to take power, hastily assembled allies, and then was overwhelmed by the Normans. It's the same sort of thing. I mean, by King William, a French foreigner, it very much echoes the Battle of Bosworth in the same way.
And something seems very broken, not in the sense of broken Britain, but that chain being broken, like the worldview that Henry VII and then subsequently his issue, the worldview that they'll have to navigate becomes completely different to the 15th century English one. As said, those recurring invasions of France, Henry VIII learns ultimately that they were a 15th century game. As you say, you're about to have the Reformation. Printing press had come in, I think, in the 1460s, but it hadn't spread in the same way. Yeah, it hadn't spread into England. So this last death of the king coming when all of these other further cultural European tides are rising is quite poignant.
Yeah. Oh, it is. It is. I feel like you're right. Like, they were just exhausted. The nobility, the people, the contending houses, Lancaster and York, they had spent themselves in these sort of insular conflict, which had engulfed the kingdom for a century. And then Richard dies on the battlefield, and Henry Tudor, the last descendant of the House of Lancaster, is declared Henry VII and marries Elizabeth of York, the last descendant of the House of York, and thus binds them together once more.
That's where you get the idea of the Tudor Rose and all that.
Yeah, precisely.
Yes, well, we've been
So
going for 2.5 hours, so which is, we've covered good ground though.
we've covered it. Yeah.
It was interesting going back over Jacobs as a whole. As I said, this is a sort of history that you can find quite immersive as a teenager, and then it's interesting going back at it. I'm a little bit older now, so yeah, with the intensity, it's still there. It still reads like a novel, but you have these larger century-wide sort of observations to to consider.
If Richard, let's say if I know a lot of the part of the beginning of the Wars of the Roses was it began as a result of differences over foreign policy between different dukes. But let's say England had lost France, but somehow the Yorkist and the Lancastrian factions had managed to become reconciled before actual warfare could break out. Or maybe if it had been sewn up a lot earlier, even if warfare had broken out, do you think that the Plantagenets would have? I mean, how do you think the next century would have gone? Like if the Tudors had never emerged, but it had just been a continuous Plantagenet reign.
I think if Edward of Anjou, right, Margaret's son, Henry VI's son, continues to reign,
right, yeah,
purely speculation. I foresee, again, assuming everything else happens the way it does, if you end up with the King of Spain and also Holy Roman Emperor and Charles V, it could be they're very a closer union to France occurs there,
right,
to try and be able to work against that.
Yeah,
and then it could have been a plaything between Spain and France. It's difficult to know.
I mean,
Edward never. You don't get a sense of Edward's character at all. This Edward of Anjou, right?
I feel like England under the Plantagenets was always a very sort of distant, benighted kingdom, insular compared with the, compared with the European, compared with the continent. Whereas under the Tudors, it sort of blossoms. Although,
yeah, and there's so much like idea of providence. It's funny though you have this vision. Henry V he believed he had God on his side completely, and that when he was walking, in fact, the walk from Harfleur to Calais, and he gets intercepted at Agincourt, he has this faith that God is with him. Okay, fair, but the sort of religiosity of a Drake, or these explorers of the 16th century, and Drake was quite a religious man, but from a Protestant point of view, right? These are almost like different faiths and different Englands and different kind of concepts. The Henry V one still strikes you. It's so medieval and almost French aristocratic in its outlook.
Yes.
Different to Drake. Yet Drake is the driver of the English destiny once they become, ruler of the waves, and that idea that they get the shipping routes out. They are the ultimate winners. I mean, that's a long track, right? It doesn't get cemented till the 7 Years' War, really. But yeah, without that, it's all. This is where the switch happens from being the land campaigns in France stop, and it gives breath to be able to explore the seas, really, and England starts to become a naval power.
Yeah.
So I don't think you may not see that naval switch.
You might not have. Yeah.
Of course, it's an island, but I'm still not. Yeah, to the same extent, they may have looked east into the land. Like, I think even in the Bedford or one of these in the 1440s wants to do the Pope wants to involve him in a Bohemian crusade against Bohemia. Yeah. I think it's the Jan Hus and the Hussites, I think, at that point. But it's just this concept that England is looking east into that world. That ends entirely. Yeah. And I think that's the Tudors coming in is helpful in that manner. But I think the external factor of Charles V and the Habsburgs is still what's overriding the change for me. It's enormous character, enormous figure.
Of course. But also Henry VIII attempted to make one last callback.
Oh yeah, he has to. Henry VIII has to realize it by doing that. It's a last century game.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like he still has like I feel like Henry VIII was very nostalgic, like a nostalgic king in
Yes,
many
he
ways.
echoes his grandfather in that sense, Edward the Fourth. You have to remember, his mother was Edward the Fourth's child, so
Yes, yes.
there is that Yorkist blood and that hot streak.
But we'll get to him later. He's an extraordinary figure as well, possibly the greatest figure of that century. In my maybe even in well, in some respects, his personality is certainly more documented than that of his daughter Elizabeth. But his daughter Elizabeth's reign was more successful. But those certainly are the two greatest figures of that era. We'll discuss it next time, whenever that occurs. But that will be quite a discussion. All the figures of the court. I look forward to Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell, Cardinal Wolsey. We'll get to them. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, guys, for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed it. And yeah, you know, if there's any good scholars of the period with their insights of England's 15th century, leave a comment. Let us know your thoughts.
Mhm.
Till next time, guys.
Thank you.